Chapter 11 Walking Tours 1. Ben Hanscom makes a withdrawal. Richie Tozier got out of the cab at the Free Day intersection of Kansas Street, Center Street, and Main Street, and Ben dismissed it at the Up Mile Hill. The driver was Bill's regulus fella, but neither Richie nor Ben knew it. Dave had lapsed into a morose silence. Ben could have gotten off with Richie, he supposed, but it seemed better somehow. But then they all started off alone. He stood on the corner of Kansas Street and derelict clothes, watching the cab pull back into traffic, hands stuffed deeply into his pockets, trying to get the lunch's hideous conclusion out of his mind. He couldn't do it. His thoughts kept returning to that black-gray fly crawling out of the fortune cookie on Bill's plate, its veined wings plastered on its back. He would try to drive his mind from the sun and healthily image, think he had succeeded, only to discover 5 minutes later that his mind was back at it. I'm trying to justify it somehow, he thought, meaning it not in normal sense, but rather in the mathematical one. Buildings are built by observing certain natural laws. Natural laws may be expressed by explanations. Equations must be justified. Where was the justification in what had happened less than half an hour? Let it alone, he told himself. Not for the first time. You can't justify it, so let it alone. Very good advice. The problem was that he couldn't take it. He remembered that the day after he had seen the mummy on the ice canal, his life had gone on as usual. He had known that whenever it had come very close to getting him, but his life had gone on. He had attended school, taken an arithmetic test, visited the library when school was over, had eaten with his usual heartiness. He had simply incorporated the things he had seen on the canal into his almost getting killed. They dashed across streets without looking. They got horsing around in the lake and suddenly realized they had floated far past their depths on their rubber rafts and had to paddle back. They fell off monkey bars on their asses and out of trees on their heads. Now, standing here in the fading drizzle in front of the trustworthy hardware store that had been a pawn shop in 1958, Friday Brothers, Ben recalled the double windows, always full of pistols and rifles and straight razors and guitars hung up by their necks like exotic animals. It occurred to him that kids were better at almost dying, and they were almost better at incorporating the examination into their lives. They believe incapable in the invisible word, miracles both bright and dark, where to be taken into conditions. Oh yes, most certainly. But they by no means stopped the world. A sudden up heaven of beauty or terror at 10 did not preclude an extra cheese dog or two or for lunch at noon. When you grew up, all that changed. You no longer lay awake in your bed. Sure, something was scratching in the closet or scratching at the window, but when something did happen, something beyond explanation. The circuit's rainbow overloaded. The axons and determinants got hot. You started to jitter and jive. You started to shake, rattle, and roll. Your imagination started to hop and bop and do the funky chicken all over your nerves. You couldn't just incorporate what had happened into your life experience. It didn't digest. Your mind kept coming back to it, pawning it, lighted lightly like a kitten with a ball of string, until eventually, of course, you either went crazy or got a plane where it was impossible for you to function. And if that happened, Ben thought, it's got me, us, cold. He started to walk up Kansan Street, not concussion of head in any place in particular, and thought silently, "What did we do with the silver dollar?" He still couldn't remember the silver dollar. Ben Beverly saved your life with it. Your maybe all the others, and especially Bill's. It almost ripped my guts out before Beverly did. What? What did she do? And how was it able to work? She backed it off, and we all helped her. But how? A word came to him suddenly, a word that meant nothing at all, though which tightened his flesh. Child. He looked down at the sidewalk, and for a moment saw the shape of a turtle chalk there, and the world seemed to swim before his eyes. He shut them tightly, and when he opened them, saw it was not a turtle, only a hopscotch grin, half erased by the light and rain. Child. What did that mean? I don't know, he said out loud, and when he looked around quickly to see if anyone had heard him talking to himself, he saw that he had turned off Kansan Street and onto Cosland Avenue. At lunch, he had told the others that the Barrens were the only place in Derry where we had felt happy as a kid. But that wasn't quite true, was it? There had been other places, either accidentally or unintentionally. He had come to that other place, the Derry Public Library. He stood in front of it for a moment or two, hands still in his pockets. It hadn't changed. He admired its lines as much now as he had as a child. Like so many stone buildings that had been well designed, it succeeded in confounded the closely observant eyes. Considerations. Its stone sonally was somehow balanced by the delicacies of its arches and slim columns. It looked both bank, safe, squat, and yet slim and clean. Well, it was slim as city buildings went, especially those slim ectories around the turn of the century. And the window, crisscrossed with narrow strips of iron, were gracefully and rounded. These contractions saved it from ugliness, and he was not entirely surprised to feel a wave of love for the place. Nothing much had changed on Costello Avenue. Glancing along it, he could see the Derry Community House, and he found himself wondering if the Costello Avenue Market was still there, at the point where the avenue which was Skellenheimer rejoined Kansan Street. He walked across the library lawn, barely noticing that his dress boots were getting wet, to have a look at that glass and passageway between the grown-ups' library and the children's library. It was almost unexchanged, and from here, standing just outside the barrel branches of a weeping willow tree, he could see people passing back and forth. The old delight flooded him, and he really forgot what had happened at the end of the reunion. Lunch for the first time. He could remember walking around to this very same spot as a kid, only in the winter, plowing his way through snow that was almost heap deep, and then standing for as long as 15 minutes. He would come at dusk, he remembered, and again it was contrasts that drew him and held him there, with the tip of his fingers going numb and snow melted inside his green gum rubber boots. It would be drawing down dark out where he was, the world going purple with early winter's shadows. The sky, the color of ashes, and the east and embers. In the west, it would be cold where he was, 10 degrees perhaps, and chillier than that if the wind was blowing across from the frozen barrens, as it so often did. But there, less than 40 yards from where he stood, people walked back and forth in their shirt sleeves. There, less than 40 yards from where he stood, was a two-way of bright, white light thrown by the overhead fluorescents. Little kids giggled together. High school sweethearts held hands, and if the librarian saw them, she would make them stop. It was somehow magical, in a good way, that he had been too young to account for with such mundane things as electric power and oil heat. The magic was that glowing cylinder of light and life connected in those two dark buildings like a life line. The magic was in watching people walk through it across the dark snowfield, untouched by either the dark or the cold. It made them lovely and godlike. Eventually, he would walk away, as he was doing now, and circle the building to the front door, as he was doing now, but he would always pause and look back once, as he was doing now, before the bulking stone shoulder of the adult library cut off the sight line to that delicate ambitiously. Refueling, amused at the ache of the nostalgia around his heart, Ben went up the steps to the door of the adult library, paused for a moment on the narrow veranda just inside the pillars, always so high and cool, no matter how hot the day. Then he pulled open the iron-bound door with the book drop slot in it and went into the quiet. The force of memories almost dazzled him for a moment as he stepped into the mild light of a hanging glass globes. The force was not pacifical, not like a shot of the jaw to the jaw or a slap. It was more a skin to that queer feeling of time doubling back on itself that people call, for want of a better term, deja vu. Ben had the feeling before, but it had never struck him with such disordering power. For the moment or two, he stood aside the door. He felt literally lost in time, not really sure how old he was. Was he 38 or 11? Here was the same murmuring quiet, broken only by an occasional whisper, the faint thud of a librarian's stamp books or overdue notice, the hush rifle of newspaper or magazine's pages being turned. He loved the quality of the light as much now as then. It slanted through the high windows, gray as a pigeon wing on this rainy afternoon, a light that was somehow solemn and dozy. He walked across the wide floor, its red and black luminous pattern almost completely worn away, trying as he had, always trying, back then to hush the sound of its football. The adult library rose up to a dome in the middle, and all sounds were magnified. He saw that circular iron staircase leading to the stacks were still there, one on either side of the horseshoe-shaped main desk. But he also saw that a tiny cagework elevator had been added at some point in the 25 years since he and his mama had moved away. It was something of a relief. It drove a wedge into that suffocating feeling of deja vu. He felt like an interloper crossing the wide floor. A spy from an other country. He kept accepting the library at the desk to raise her head, looked at him, and then challenged him in clear, ringing tones that would shatter the countenance of every reader here and focus every eye upon him. You, yes you, what are you doing here? You have no business here. You're from outside. You're from before. Go back where you came from. Go back right now before I call the police. Lise, she did look up, a young girl, pretty and for one absurd moment. It seemed to Ben that the fantasy was really going to come true, and his heart rose into his throat, and her pale blue eyes touched his. Then they passed on interpretlessly, and Ben would found he would walk away. If he was a spy, he didn't found being found out. He passed under the coil of one of the narrow and almost suicidally stepped roweled iron staircase on his way to the corridor leading to the children's library, and was amused to realize only after he had done it that he had run down another old track of his childhood behavior. He had looked up, hoping as he had hoped as a kid, to see a girl in a skirt coming down those steps. He could remember, now he could remember, glancing up there for no reason at all one day when he was 8 or 9 and looking right up the skirt of a pretty high school girl and seeing her clean pink underwear as the sudden sight-lit glint of Beverly Marsh's ankle bracelets had shot an arrow of something more prevalent than simple love or affection through his heart on the last day of school in 1958. So had the sight of the high school girl's panties affect him. He could remember sitting at a table in the children's library and thinking of that unexpected view for perhaps as long as 20 minutes, his cheeks and forehead hot, a book about the history of trains open and unread before his penis, a hard little branch in his pants, a branch that had stuck its roots all the way up into his belly. He had fascinated eyes, the two of them married, living in a small house on the outskirts of town, indulging in pleasures he did not in the least understand. The feelings had passed off almost as suddenly as they had come, but he had never walked under the stairway again without glancing up. He hadn't ever seen anything else as interesting or affected. Once a fat lady worked her way down with patrician care, but he had looked away from that sight hastily, feeling ashamed like a violator, but the habit preceded it. He had done it again now. As a grown man, he walked slowly down the glass-in passageway, noticing other changes now. Yellow decals that said, OPEC loves it when you waste energy, so save a watt, had been plastered over the switch plates. The frame pictures on the far wall when he entered the scaled-down world of blonde wood tables and small blonde wood chairs. This world where the drinking fountage was only 4 feet high were not of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, but of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Reagan, Ben recalled, had been host of G.N. Theater in the year that Ben had graduated from the 5th grade, and George Bush would not have seen 30 yet, but that feeling of deja vu swept in again. He was helpless before and at this time he felt the numb horror of a man who finally realizes after half an hour of helpless splashing that the shore is growing no closer and he is drowning. It was story hour, and over in a corner a group of roughless, a dozen little ones sat solemnly on their tiny chairs in a sentimental listening. Who is that trapping upon my bridge? The librarian said in the low growling tones of the troll in the story, and Ben thought, when she raises her hand, I'll see that it's Miss Davins. Yes, it'll be Miss Davins, and she won't look a day older. But when she did raise her hand, he saw a much younger woman than Miss Davins had been even then. Some of the children covered their mouth and giggled, but others only watched her. Their eyes reflected the internal fascination of the fairy story. Would the monster be bested, or would it feed? It is I, Billy Goat Gruff, trip-trapping on your bridge, the librarian went on, and Ben, paled, walked past her. How can it be the same story, the very same story? Am I supposed to believe that's just a conditioning? Because I don't. God damn it. I just don't. He bent to the drinking fountain, bending so far he felt like Richie doing one of his Solomon Ballin' routines. I ought to talk to someone, he thought, panicking. Mike Bill, someone is something is really staple in the past and present together here. Or am I only imagine it? Because if I'm not sure I barrage for his much. He looked at the checkout desk, and his heart seemed to stop in his chest for a moment before beginning to race double time. The poster was simple, stark, and so familiar. It said, remember the curfew, 7 p.m., Derry Police Department. Is that instant it all seemed to come clear to him. It came in a grisly flash of light, and he realized that the vote they had taken was a joke. There was no turning back, never had been. They were on a track as proscenitined as the memory track which had caused him to look up when he passed under the stairway leading to the stacks. There was an echo here in Derry, a deadly echo, and all they could hope for was that the echo could be changed enough in their favor to allow them to escape with their lives. Christ, he muttered, and scrubbed a palm up one cheek. Hard. Can I help you, sir? A voice at his elbow asked, and he jumped a little. It was a little girl of perhaps 17, her dark blonde hair held back from her pretty high schooler's face, with Barriets, a library assistants. Of course, they had been in 1958 too. High school girls and boys who shelved books, showed kids how to use the card catalog, discussed book reports and school papers, helped be wilder schoolers with their footnotes in boilographics. The pay was a pittance, but they were always kids willing to do it. It was agreeable work on the heels of this, reading the girl's pleasance but questioning, looking a little more closely. He remembered that he no longer really been longed here. He was a giant in a land of little people, an intruder in the adults' library. He had felt uneasy about the possibility of being looked at or spoken to, but here it was something of a relief. For one thing, it proved he was still an adult, and the fact that the girl was clearly priceless under her thin Western style shirt was also more relief than turn on, if proof that this was 1985 and not 1958 was needed. The clearly lemon points of her nipples against the cotton of her shirt was it. No, thank you, he said, and then for no reason at all that he could understand, he heard himself add, I was looking for my son. Oh, what's his name? Maybe I've seen him. She smiled. I know most of the kids. His name is Ben Hanscom, he said, but I don't see him. Tell me what he looks like, and I'll give him a message, if there is one. Ben, uncomfortably now, he beginning to wish he had never started this. He's a stout side, and he looks like a little bit like me. But it's no big deal, miss. If you see him, just tell him his dad popped by on his way home. I will, she said, and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and Ben suddenly realized that she didn't come over and spoken to him out of a simple politeness, in which to help. She happened to be a library assistant in the children's library in a town where 9 children had been slain over a span of 8 months. You see a strange man in a scaled-down world where adults rarely expect to drop their kids off or pick them up. You're suspicious, of course. Thank you, he said, gave her a smile he hoped was reassuring, and then got the hell out. He walked back for the corridor to the adults' library and went to the desk on the impulse. He didn't understand, but of course, they were supposed to follow their impulses this afternoon, weren't they? Followed their impulses and see where they led. The nameplate on the circulations desk identified the pretty young librarian as Carlo Denner. Behind her, Ben could see a door with a frosted glass panel letter on this was Michael Hanlon, head librarian. May I help you, Miss Danner asked. I think so, Ben said. That is, I hope so. I'd like to get a library card. Very good, she says, and took out a form. Are you a resident of Derry? Not personally. Home address then? Rural starts, Route 2. Hemogorford Home, Nebraska. He paused for a moment, a little amused by her stare, and then reeled off the zip code 59341. Is this a joke, Mr. Hanscom? Not at all. Are you moving to Derry then? I have no plans to. No, this is a long way to come to borrow books, isn't it? Don't they have libraries in Nebraska? It's kind of a sentimental thing, Ben said. He would have thought telling a stranger this would be embarrassed, but he found it wasn't. I grew up in Derry, you see. This is the first time I've been back since I was a kid. I've been walking around seeing what's changed and what hasn't. And all at once it occurred to me that I spent about 10 years of my life here, being and age 3 and 13, and I don't have a single thing to remember those years by, not so much as a postcard. I have some silver dollars, but not lost ones of them. I gave the rest to a friend. I guess what I want is a souvenir of my childhood. It's late, but don't they say better late than ever? Charles Damer smiled, and the smile changed her pretty face into one that was beautiful. I think that's very sweet, she said. If you like to browse for 10 or 15 minutes, I'll have the card made up for you when you come back to the desk. Ben grinned a little. I guess there'll be a fee, he said. Out of towner and all. Did you have a card when you were a boy? I sure did, Ben smiled, except for my friends. I guess that little library card was the most important. Ben, would you come up? Here a voice called suddenly, cutting across the library, hushed like a scalpel. He turned around, jumping guilty, the way people do when someone shouts in the library. He saw no one he knew, and realized a moment later that no one had looked up or shown any sign of surprise or annoyance. The old man still read their copies of the Derry News, the Boston Globe, National Geographic or Time, Newsweek, USA News, and World Report. At the table in the reference room, 2 high school girls still had their heads together over a stack of paper and a pile of file cards. Several browsers went on looking through the books. On the shelves marked Current Fiction, 7 Days Loan. An old man in a ridiculous driving cap, a cold pipe clenched between his teeth, went on leafing through a folio of Lucien D. Vaccarin sketches. He turned back to the young woman who was looking at him, puzzled. Is anything wrong? No, Ben said, smiled. I thought I heard something. I guess I'm more jet-lagged than I thought. What were you saying? Well, actually, you were saying, but I was about to add that if you had a card when you were a resident, your name will still be in a file, she said. We keep everything on matrifaction now. Some change from when you were a kid here, I guess. Yes, he said, a lot of things have changed in Derry, but a lot of things also seem to have remained the same. Anyway, I can just look you up and give you a renewal card. No change. That's great, Ben said, and before he could add thanks, the voice cut through the library's cemental silence again, louder now, unnaturally jolly. Come on up, Ben. Come on up, you fat little fuck. This is your life, Ben Hanscom. Ben cleared his throat. I appreciate it, he said. Don't mention it. She cocked her head at him. Hasn't it gone? Did warm outside? A little, he said. Why? Your Ben Hanscom did it, the voice screamed. It was coming from above, coming from the stacks. Ben Hanscom killed the children. Get him! Grab him! Persurian, she finished. Am I? He said integrally. I'll have this made up right away, she said. Thank you. She headed for the old royal typewriter at the corner of her desk. Ben walked slowly away, his heart a thudding drum in his chest. Yes, he was sweating. He could feel it trickling down from his forehead, his armpits, matting the hair on his chest. He looked up and saw Pennywise the Clown standing on the top of the left side staircase, looking at him. His face was white, with grease paint. His mouth bled lipstick and a killer's grin. There were empty sockets where his eyes should have been. He held a bunch of balloons in one hand and a book in the other. Not he, Ben thought. It. I am standing here in the middle of Derry in the public library's rotunda on a late spring afternoon in 1985. I am a grown man and I am face to face with my childhood's greatest nightmare. I am face to face with it. Come on up, Ben, Pennywise called down. I won't hurt you. I got a book for you and a book and a balloon. Come on up. Ben opened his mouth to call back. You're insane if you think I'm going up there. And suddenly realized that if he had did that, everyone here would be looking at him. Everyone here would be thinking, who is that crazy man? Oh, I know you can't answer, Pennywise called down, giggled and giggled. Almost fooled you there for a minute through, didn't I? Pardon me, sir. Do you have Prince Albert in a can? You do? Well, you better let the poor guy out. Pardon me, ma'am. Is your refrigerator running? It is. Then hadn't you better go catch it? The clown on the landing threw its head back and shrieked laughter. It roared and echoed in the dome of the rounding like a flight of black bats, and Ben was only able to keep from clapping his hands over his ears with a tremendous effort of will. Come on up, Ben, Pennywise called him down. We'll talk natural grounds. What do you say? I'm not coming up there, Ben thought. When I finally come to you, you won't to see me. I think we're going to kill you. The clown shrieked laughter again. Ha ha! Kill me? Kill me? And suddenly, horribly, the voice was Richie Tozier's voice. Not his voice, precisely, but Richie Tozier doing his Pickaninny voice. Don't kill me, massa. I be a good nugga. Don't kill Trissa, black boy. Haystack! Then that shrinking laughter, trembling, white-faced. Ben walked across the echoing center of the adults' library. He felt that soon he would vomit. He stood in front of a shelf of books and took one down, at random with a hand that trembled badly. His cold fingers filtered the pages. This is your one chance, Haystack. The voice called from behind and above him. Get out of town. Get out of the town before it gets dark tonight. I'll be after you together. You and the others. Besides, you're too old to stop me, Ben. You're all too old. Too old to do anything but get yourself killed. Get out, Ben. Don't you want to see this tonight? He turned slowly, still holding the book in his icy hand. He didn't want to look, but it was as if there were an invisible hand under his chin, tilting his head up, and then up and up. The clown was gone. Dracula was standing at the top of the left-hand stairway, but it was no movie Dracula. It was not Bela Leopard or Christopher Lee or Frank Lettigan or Francis Lenador or Reggie Nondler. An ancient man-thing with a face like a twisted root stood there. Its face was deadly pale, its eyes pearlicious red, the color of bloodcocks. Its mouth dropped open, revealing a mouthful of glittering blue blades that had been set in a gums at angles. It was like looking in into a deadly mirror maze, where a single missteps could get cut in half. Key wrench, it screamed, and its jaw snapped closed. Blood gouted from its mouth in a red-black blood. Chunks of its severed lips fell to the glowing white slick of its formal shirt and slid down its front, leaving snail trails of blood behind him. What did Stan Urris see before he died? The vampire on the landing screamed down at him, laughing through the bloody hole of its mouth. Was it Prince Albert in a can? Was it Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier? What did he see, Ben? Do you want to see it too? What did he see? What did he see? Then that shrinking laughter again, and Ben knew that he would scream now himself, yes. There was no way to stop the screaming. It was going to come. Blood was pattering down from the land in a grimly shower. One drop and had landed on the Harrison's bunch hand of an old man who was reading the Wall Street Journal. It was running down between his knuckles, unseen and unfelt. Ben hitched in breath, sure the scream would follow, unthinkable in the quiet of this softly drizzle spring afternoon, as shocking as the slash of a knife or a mouthful of razor blades. Instead, what came out of the shanky, uneven rush, spoken instead of scream, spoken low like a prayer. Where are these words? We made slugs out of it. Of course, we made the silver dollar into silver slugs. The gentleman in the driving cap, who had been pursuing the De Vagran sketches, looked up sharply. Nonsense, he said. Now people did look up. Someone hissed, shh, at the old man in the annoying voice. I'm sorry, Ben said in a low, trembling voice. He was faintly aware that his face was now running with sweat and that his shirt was plashing it to his body. I was thinking out loud. Nonsense, the old gentleman repeated in a louder voice. Can't make silver bullets from silver dollars. Come on, Mashudans. Pulp Fiction. Problem is with specific gravity. Suddenly, the woman Miss Danner was there. Mr. Brock Hill. You'll have to be quiet, she said kindly. Enough. People are reading. Man's sick, Brock Hill said abruptly and went back to his book. Gave him an aspirin. Carol Danner looked at Ben, and her face sharpened with concern. Are you ill, Mr. Hanscom? I know it's terrible, and polite to say so, but you look terrible. Ben said, I had Chinese food for lunch. I don't think it's agreed with me. If you want to lie down, there's a cot in Mr. Hanlon's office. You could. No thanks, but no. What he wanted was not to lie down, but to get the hell out of the Derry Public Library. He looked up at the land, and the clown was gone. The vampire was gone, but tied to the low, wound iron railing which surrounded the lantern was a balloon. Written on its bludgeon skin were the words, "Have a good day. Tonight you die." "I've got the library card," she said, putting the Tread's hand on his arm. "Do you still want it?" "Yes, thanks," Ben said. He drew a deep, stuttering breath. "I'm very sorry about this. I just hope it isn't food poisoning," she said. "Wouldn't work," Mr. Brock Hill said without looking up from D. Vagrants or Reuven, his dead pipe from the corner of his mouth. Device of Pulp Fiction. Bullet would tumble, and speaking again, with no foreknowledge that he was going to speak. Ben said, "Sludge, not bullets." He realized almost right away that we couldn't make bullets. I mean, we were just kids. It was my idea to shh, someone said again. Brock Hill gave Ben a slightly startled look, seemed about to speak, then went back to the sketches. At the desk, Carol Danner handed him a small orange card with Derry Public Library stamped across the top. Be amused, Ben realized it was the first adult library he had owned in his whole life. The one he had as a kid had been canary yellow. Are you sure you don't want to lie down, Mr. Hanscom? I'm feeling a little better, thanks. Sure. He managed a smile. I'm sure. You do look like a little better, she said. But she said it doubtfully, as if understanding that this was the proper thing to say, but not really believing it. Then she was holding a book under the microfilm gadget they use these days to record book loans, and Ben felt a touch of almost hierarchic amusement. It's the book I grabbed off the shelf when the clown started to do its piccaninny voice, he thought. She thought I wanted to borrow it. I've made my first withdrawal from the Derry Public Library in 25 years, and I don't even know what the book is. Furthermore, I don't care. Just let me out of here, okay? That'll be enough. Thank you, he said, putting the book under his arm. You're more than welcome, Mr. Hanscom. Are you sure you wouldn't like an aspiratin? Quite sure, he said, and then hesitated. You wouldn't by any chance know what happened to Mrs. Starrett, would you? Byron Street, Scarrett? She used to be the head of the children's library. She died, Carol Danner said, 3 years ago. It was a stroke. I understand. It was a great shame. She was relatively young, 58 or 9, I think. Mr. Hanlon closed the library for the day. Oh, Ben said, and felt a hollow place open in his heart. That's what happens when you got back to your used-to-be, as the song put it. The frosting on the cake was sweet, but the stuff underneath was bitter. People forgot you, or died on you, or lost their hair and teeth. In some cases, you found that they had lost their minds. Oh, it was great to be alive, boy howdy. I'm sorry, she said. You liked her, didn't you? All the kids liked Mrs. Scarrett, Ben said, and was alarmed to realize that tears were now very closed. Are you? If she asks me if I'm all right one more time, I really am going to cry, I think, or scream or something. He glanced at his watch and said, I really have to run. Thanks for being so nice. Have a nice day, Mr. Hanscom. Sure, because tonight I die. He tipped a finger her way and started back across the floor. Mr. Brock Hill glanced up at him once, sharply and suspiciously. He looked up at the landing which topped the left-hand staircase. The balloon still floated there, tied up by its string to lacy Waffern iron. But now the printing on its side read, I killed Barbarian Starrett, Pennywise the Clown. He looked away, feeling the pulse in his throat, starting to run again. He let himself out and was startled by the sunlight. The clouds overhead were coming unravel, and a warm late May sun was shafting down, making the grass look impossibly green and lush. Ben felt something start to lift from his heart. It seemed to him that he had left some insupportable burden behind in the library. And then he looked down at the book he had invertebrated withdraw, and his teeth clamped together with sudden painful force. It was Bulldozer by Stephen W. Meander, one of the books he had withdrawn from the library on the day he had divided into the barrens to get away from Henry Bowers and his friends. And speaking of Henry, the track of his engineer boots was still on the book's cover. Shaken, fumbling at the pages, he turned to the back. The library had gone over to the macroflora checkout system. He had seen that, but there was still a pocket in the back of his book with a card tucked into it. There was name written on each line of the card, followed by the librarian's return date stamp. Looking at the card, Ben saw this. Name of the borrowers, returned by stamp date. Charles N. Brown, May 1458. David Hardwell, June 158. Joseph Burnett, June 1758. And on the last of the card, his own childish signature, within in heavy pencil strokes. Benjamin Hanscom, July 9, 58. Stamp across this card. Stamp across the book's fly leaf. Stamp across the thickness of the pages. Stamped again and again in smeary red ink that looked like blood was one word. Cancel. Oh, dear God, Ben murmured. He did not know what else to say that seemed to cover the entire situation. Oh, dear God, dear God. He stood in the new sunlight, suddenly wondering what was happening to the others. 2. Eddie Kasbrack makes a catch. Eddie got off the bus at the corner of Kansas Street and Cowsif Lane. Cowsif was a street that ran a quarter of a mile downhill before dead-ended absurdly when the crumbling earth slopped into the barrens. He had absolutely no idea why he had chosen this place to leave the bus. Cowsif Lane meant nothing to him, and he had known no one on this particular section on Kansas Street, but it seemed like the right place. That was all he knew. But at this point, it seemed to be enough. Beverly had climbed off the bus with a little wave at one of the lower Main Street stops. Mike had taken his car back to the library, now watching the small and somehow observed Macedon bus pulled away. He wondered exactly what he was doing here, standing on an Obstinate Street corner in an obstinate town nearly 500 miles away from Marin, who was undoubtedly worried to tears about him. He felt an instant of almost painful vertigo, touched his jacket pocket, and remembered that he had left his Dramamine back at the house along with the rest of the periscopics. He had aspirin, though. He would no more have gone sans aspiraturn than he would have gone out sans pants. He chugged a couple dry and began to walk along Kansas Street, thinking vagiously that he might go to the public library or perhaps cross over to the Consolone Avenue. It was beginning to clear now, and he supposed he could even walked across to the West Broadway and admired the old Victorian houses that stood there along the only two really handsome residential blocks in Derry. He used to do that sometimes when he was a kid, just walked along West Broadway, sort of casual, like he was on his way to somewhere else. There was the Mullers, the near corner of Witcham and West Broadway, a red house with turnips on either sides and hedges in front. The Mullers had a gardener who always looked at Eddie with suspicious eyes until he had passed on his way. Then there was the Bowies' house, which was 4 down from the Mullers on the same side. One of the reasons he supposed that Greta Bowie and Sally Muller had been such great friends in grammar school, it was green-singled and also had turrets. But while the turrets on the Mullers' house were squared off, those on the Bowies' house were capped with funny cone-shaped things that looked to Eddie like squatting dunes caps. In the summer, there was always log furnitures on the side lawn, a table with a sporty yellow umbrella over it, wicker chairs, a rope hammock stretched between two trees. There was always a carpeted game set up out back, too. Eddie knew this, although he had never been invited over to Greta's house to play croquet, walking by casually, like he was on his way to somewhere else. Eddie would sometimes hear the click of the ball's laughter groans as someone's ball was sent away once. He had seen Greta herself eliminated in one hand and her croquet mullet in the other, looking slim and pretty beyond the words of all the poets. Ever her sunburned shoulders seemed wonderfully pretty to Eddie Kasprak, who had at that time been 9, going after her ball, who had been sent away. It had rotted off a tree and had first brought Greta into Eddie's view. He fell in love with her a little that day, her shining blonde hair fallen to the shoulders of her clawwood dress, which was a cool blue. She glanced around, and for a moment he thought she had seen him, but that proved not to be so, because when he raised his hand in a timid hello, she did not raise her in return, but only whacked her ball back onto the rear lawn, and then ran after it. He had walked on with no restimate. At the unreturned hello, he genuinely believed she must not have seen him, or at the fact that he had never been invited or attended one of the Saturday afternoon croquet games. Why would a beautiful girl like Greta Bowery want to invite a kid like him? He was thin-chested, asthmatic, and had the face of a drowned water rat. Yeah, he thought, walking aimlessly back down Kansas Street. I should have gone over to West Broadway and looked at all those houses again. The Mullers, the Bowies, Dr. Hale's place, the Trackers. His thoughts broke off abruptly at the last name, because speak of the devil, here he was standing in front of Tracker's Brothers truck depot. Still right here, Eddie said aloud and laughed. Son of a gun! The house on West Broadway, which belonged to Phil and Tony Tracker, a pair of lifelong Balakers, was probably the loveliest of the large houses on the street, a spotless white mid-victory with green lawns and great beds of flower that roited it in a nearly landscape way, of course, all the spring and summer long. Their driveways was freshly scaled each other fall, so that it always remained as black as a dark mirror. The slate shingles on the many slants of the roof were always a perfect mint green that almost exactly matched the lawn, and people sometimes stopped to take pictures of the Mullendon windows, which were very old and quite remarkable. Any two men who bothered keeping a house so nice must be queers, Eddie's mother had once said in a disgruntled sort of way, and Eddie hadn't dared ask for clarification. The truck depot was the exact opposite of the Tracker house on West Broadway. It was a low brick structure. The bricks were old and crumbly in places, their dirty orange hues shadowed to a snooty black. At the building's footings, the windows were uncomfortably filthy except for a small circular place on one of the lower panes of the starter's office. This one pane had been kept spotlessly clean by kids before Eddie and those who came after, because the starter kept a Playboy calendar over his desk. No boy came to play scratch baseball in the black lot without first stopping to wipe at the glass with the ball glove and examine that mouth's pin-up. The depot was surrounded by a waste of gravel on three sides, long distance, Healers, Jimmy Pete's, and Ken Worth's, and Royals, all painted with the words Tracker Bros. Derry Newton, Provence, Hartford, New York, sometimes stood here, entangled disorder, profusion. Sometimes they were put together, and sometimes they were just cabs or body boxes, standing silent on their rear wheels and support struts. The brothers kept their trucks out of the lot at the back of the building as much as they could, because they were both avid baseball fans and liked the kids to come and play. Phil Tracker drove firefight himself, so the boys rarely saw him. But Tony Tracker, a man with an Eddie who never played his mother, would have killed him if she had heard and he was playing baseball, racing around and getting dust in his delighted lungs, risking broken legs, concussions, and God alone knew what else. Got used to seeing him. He was a summer fixture, his voice as much a part of the game to Eddie than as Mel Allen's later become, Tony Tracker, large but somehow ghost-like, his white shirt glimmering as summer dusk drew down of fireflies, began to loom the air with their lace of lights, yelling, "You got to get under that burl before you can catch it, Red. You took your eye off in the half burl, half prit. You can't bit the goddamn thing if you ain't looking at it. Slide, horsefoots. You got the souls of them, kids. And that second baseman's face. He ain't never gon' tag you out. Never called any of them by name. Eddie remembered it was always, hey, Red. Hey, Blondie. Hey, Four Eyes. Hey, Half Prince. It was never a ball. It was always a ball. It was never a bat. It was always something Tony Tracker call an ash handle, as you ain't never gon' hit that burl if you don't choke up on the ash handle horsefoot. Grinning Eddie walked a little closer, and then the grin faded. The long brick building where orders had been proceeded, trucks repaired, and goods stored on a term basis was now dark and silent. Weeds were growing up through the gravel, and there were no trucks in either side yard. Only a single box, its sides rusty and dull. Getting closer still, he saw that there was a realtor's for sale. Sign in the window, Trackers out of business. He fought and was surprised at the sadness the thought carried with it, as if someone had died. He was glad now he hadn't walked over to West Broadway. If Tracker Butchers could have gone under, Tracker Brothers, which had seemed eternal, what might have happened on that street he had liked so much to walk down as a kid. He realized uneasily that he didn't want to know. He didn't want to see Greta Bowie with gray hair, her hips and legs fictin', with much sitting and much eating and much drinking. It was better, safer, to just stay away. That's what we all should have done. Just stay away. We've got no business here. Coming back to where you grew up is like doing some crazy yoga trick, putting your feet in your own mouth and somehow swallowing yourself so there's nothing else. It can't be done. And any sane person out to be fucking glad it can't. What to do, you're supposed to happen to Tony and Phil Tracker anyway. A heart attack for Tony. Perhaps he had been carrying maybe 75 extra pounds of meat on his bones. You had to watch out for what your heart might be up to. The poets might romancing about broken hearts, and Baron Milio sing about them. And that was fine by Eddie. He and Marin had every album Barry Milio had ever recorded it, but he himself preferred a good solid EKG every year. Sure, Tony's heart had probably given up as a bad job, and Phil, bad luck on a highway maybe. Eddie, who made his living behind the wheel himself, or had these days, he only drove the celebs and spent the rest of his time driving a desk, knew about bad luck on the highway. Old Phil might have jactified a rig somewhere in New Hampshire or in the Hansonville woods up north in Maine when the going was icy, or maybe he had lost his brakes on some long hill south of Derry, heading into heaven in a driving springtime rain. Those things, or any of the others you heard in those shit-kicking country songs about truck drivers who wore sentence hats and had cheating on their mind. Driving a desk was sometimes lonely, but Eddie had been in the driver's seat himself more than once, his aspiratin riding there with him on the dashboard, its trigger reflected ghostly in the windshield, in a bucket and a load of pills, in the gloves coming apart, and he knew that real loneliness was a smearing red, the color of the taillights of the car ahead of you, reflecting on wet hot top in a driving rain. Oh shit, the time goes by, Eddie Kasprak said in a slightened sort of whisper, and was not even aware that he had spoken aloud, feeling both mellow and unhappy, a state more common to him than he ever would have believed. Eddie skirted the building, Gucci's loafers crunching in the gravel, to look at the lot where the baseball games had been played when he was a kid, when he seemed 90% of the world had been made up of kids. The lot wasn't much change, but a look was enough to convince him beyond doubt that the games had stopped, a tradition that had simply died out at some point in the years between for reasons of its own. In 1958, the diamond shape of the infield had been defined not by limbed base paths, but in ruts made by running feet. They had no actual bases. Those boys who had played baseball here, boys who were all older, the losers, although Eddie remembered now that Stan Uris had sometimes played, his batting was only fair, but in a outfield he could run fast, and he had the reflex of an angel. That 4 pieces of dirty cabins were always kept under the loading bay behind the long brick building, to the certainly taken out when enough kids had drifted into the back lot to play ball, and just as certainly return when the shades of evening had fallen thickly enough to end their play. Standing here now, Eddie could see no trace of those rotten base paths. Weeds had grown up through the gravel, and patchy puffins, broken soda, and beer bottles twinkled here and there. In the old days, such shards of broken glass had been religiously removed. The only thing that was the same was the chain link fence at the back of the lot, 12 feet, and as rusty as dried blood. It framed the sky in droves of diamond shapes. That was home run territory, Eddie thought, standing between with his hand in his pocket at the place where home plate had been 27 years ago, over the fence and down into the barrens. They used to call it the auto mechanic. He laughed out loud and then looked around nervously as if there were a ghost who had laughed out loud instead of a guy in $60 slacks. A guy as solid as well as solid as. Get off it, Ed's Richie's voice seemed to whisper. You ain't solid at all, and in the last few years the chucks have been few and far between, right? Yeah, right. Eddie said in a low voice and kicked a few loose stones away in the rattle. In truth, he had only seen 2 balls go over the fence at the back of the lot behind Tracker Brothers, both of them hit by the same kid, Belch Huggins. Belch had been almost permanently big already, 6 feet tall at 12, weighing maybe 120. He had gotten his nickname because he was able to accomplish belches of amazing ledge and loudness as his best. He sounded like a cross between a bullfrog and a cinder. Sometimes he would pat a hand rapidly across his open mouth while belching, emitting a sound like a hoarse Indian. Belch had been big, not really fat. Eddie remembered now, but it was as if God had never really intended it for a boy of 12 to attain such remarkable size. If he had not died that summer, he might have grown to 6'6" or better, and might have learned along the way how to maneuver his outsized body through a world of smaller size. He might even, Eddie thought, have learned gentlely, but at 12 he had been both clumsy and mean, not retarded, but almost seemed so because all his body's actions seemed so amazingly graceless and lugging. He had none of Stanley's built-in rhythms. It was as if Belch's body did not talk to his brains at all, but existed in its own cosmos of slow thunder. Eddie could remember the evening a long, slow fly ball had been hit directly to Belch's position in the outfield. Belch didn't even have to move. He stood looking up, raised his glove in an almost aimless punching gesture. And instead of settling into his glove, the ball had struck him squarely on top of the head, producing a hollow bonk sound. It was as if the ball had been dropped from 3 stories up onto the roof of a Ford Sundone. It bounced up a good 4 feet and came down neatly into Belch's glove. An unfortunate kid named Owen Phillips had laughed at that bonkin' sound. Belch had walked over to him and had kicked his ass so hard that the Phillips kid had run screaming for home with a hole in the seat of his pants. No one else laughed, at least not in the outside. Eddie supposed that if Richie Tozier had been there, he wouldn't have been able to help it. Belch probably would have put him in a hospital. Belch was similarly slow at the plate. He was easy to strike out, and if he hit a grounder, even the most vulnerable Fingrid infielders had no trouble throwing him out at first. But when he got all of one, it went a long, long way. The 2 balls Eddie had seen Belch hit over the fence had both been wonders. The first had never been recovered, although more than a dozen boys had tramped back and forth over the steeply slanted slope, which plugged down into the barrens, looking for it. The second, however, had been recovered. The ball belonged to an utter 6th grader. Eddie could not now remember what his real name had been, only that all the other kids called him Snuffy because he was always had a cold and had been in the use for most of late spring and early summer of '58. As a result, it was no longer the nearly perfect Serpentine creation of White Horse Ride and Red Snitchin' that it had been when it come out of the box. It was scuffed, grass-stained, and cut in several places by its hundreds of bouncing trips over the gravel in the outfield. Its snitching was beginning to come unravel in one place, and Eddie, who shagged follow balls when his asthma wasn't too bad, relenting every casual thanks kid when he threw the ball back to the playing field, knew that soon someone would produce a roll of black cat friction tape and element it, so they could get another week or so out of it. Before that day came, a 7th grader with an unlikely name of Stringer Denham tossed that he fancied a change of speed pitch to Belch Huggins. Belch timed to pitch perfectly. The slow ones were, you should pardon the pun, just as speed, and hit Snuffy's idly splatted so hard that the cover came right off and fluttered down just a few feet shy of second base like a big white moth. The ball itself had continued up and up into the gorgeous twilit sky, unraveling and unraveling as it went. Kids turning to follow its progress in dumb wonder. Up and over the chain link fence it went, still rising, and Eddie remembered Stringer Denham had said, "Holy shit," in a soft and awestruck voice as it went right in a track into the sky, and they had all seen the unwinding strings, and maybe even before it hit 6 boys had been monkeying up that fence, and Eddie could remember Tony Tracker laughing in an amazed loon-like way and crying that one would have been out of Yankee Stadium. Do you hear me? That one would have been out of a fucking Yankee Stadium. It had been Peter Gordon who had found the ball not far from the stream the Losers Club would dam up less than 3 weeks later. What was left was not even 3 inches through the center. It was some kind of cockned miracle that was the twine had never broken by unspoken consent. The boys had brought the remains of Snuffy's ball back to Tony Tracker, who examined it without saying a word, surrounded by boys, who were likewise silent, seen from a front distance. That circle of boys standing around the tall man with the big slopping belly might have seemed almost religious in its intent, the veneration of a holy object. Belch Huggins had not even run around the bases. He only stood among the others like a boy who had been no price's idea of where he was. What Tony Trackett handed him that day was smaller than a tennis ball. Eddie, lost in his memory, walked from the place where home had been across the pitcher's mound, only it had never been a mount and had been depression from which the gravel had been scraped clean, and out into the stop country. He paused briefly, struck by the silence. and then strolled on out to the chain link fence. It was rustier than ever and overgrown by some sort of ugly climbing vine, but still there, looking through it, could seen how the ground slopped away aggressively green. The barrens were more jungle-like than ever, and for the first time he found himself wondering why a stretch of such tangled and and growth should have been called the barrens at all. It was many things, but barren was not one of them. Why not the wilderness or the jungle? Barrens. It had an ominous, almost sinister sound, but what it conjured up in the mind were not tangle of shrubs and trees so thick they had to fight for sun space. It called up pictures of sand dunes shifting away endlessly, or gray slant expanses of hard pan and desert. Baron Mike had said earlier that they were all barren, and it seemed true enough. 7 of them, and not a kid among them, even in this day of Planned Parenthood that was bucking the odds. He looked through the rusty diamond shape, hearing the faraway drone of cars on Kansas Street, the faraway trickle and rush of water down below. He could see glints of it in the spring sunshine, like flashes of glass. The bamboo stands were still down there, looking unhealthily white like patches of fungus, and all the green beyond them, in the Martian stretches of ground bordering the Kanzuk there was supposed to have been quick mud. I spent the happiest time of my childhood down there, in that mess. He fought and shivered. He was about to turn away when something else caught his eyes, a cement cylinder with a heavy steel cap on the top. Morlock holes, Ben used to call them, laughing with his mouth, but not quite laughing with his eyes. If you went over to one, it would have stand, maybe, weight high on you. If you were a kid, and you would see the words Dairy Department or of Public Works stamped in raised metal in a circular, and you could hear a humming noise from deep inside, some sort of machinery. Morlock holes. There was we went in August in the end. We went into one of Ben's Morlock holes, into the sewers. But after a while, they were sewers anymore. They were what? Patrick Hawkscatter was down there before it took him. Beverly saw him doing something bad. It made her laugh, but she knew it was bad, something to do with Henry Bowers. Wasn't it? Yes, I think so. And he turned away suddenly and started back towards the abandoned depot, not wanting to look down into barrens anymore, not like the thoughts they conjured up. He wanted to be home with Mara. He didn't want to be here. Catch kid. He turned toward the sound of the voice, and here came some sort of ball right over the fence and toward him. It struck the grave and bounced. Eddie stuck out his hand and caught it up. In his unthinking reflex, the catch was so needed. It was almost elegant. He looked down at what was his hand, and everything inside him went cool and loose. Once it had been a baseball. Now it was only a string-wrapped spear because the cover had been knocked off. He would see the string trailing away. It went over the top of the fence like a stand of spider web and disappeared into the barrens. Oh, Jesus, he thought. Oh, Jesus, it's here. It's here with me now. Come on down and play, Eddie. The voice on the other side of the time fence said, and Eddie realized with a faint sort of horror that it was the voice of Belch Huggins, who had been murdered in the tunnels under Derry in August of 1958. And now here was Belch himself struggling up and over the bank on the other side of the fence. He wore a pinstriped New York Yankees baseball uniform that was flecked with his bits of autumn and leaves and smears with green. He was Belch, but he was also the leper, a creature hidden hideously, erased from long years in a wet grave. The flesh of his heavy face hung in perchance long years in a wet grave. The flesh over his heavy face hung in pursued strings and runners. One eye socket was empty. Things squirted in his hair. He wore a moss-slimed baseball glove on one hand. His poked the rotten fingers of his right hand through the diamonds if the chain links fence, and he curled them. Eddie heard a dreadful squirting sound, which he had thought might drive him mad. That one would have been out of Yankee Stadium, Belch said, and grinned. A toad, noxiously white and squirming, dropped from his mouth and trembled to the ground. Do you hear me? That one you would have been out of fucking Yankee Stadium. And by the way, Eddie, do you want a blowjob? I'll do it for a dime. Hell, I'll do it for free. Belch's face changed. The jelly-like bulb of nose fell in revealing two raw red channels that Eddie had been seen in his dreams. His hair, coruscant and drew back from his temple, turned cobwebs white. The rotten skin on his forehead split open, revealing white bone covered with a musky substance, like the blurred lens of a searchlight. Bletch was gone. The thing which had been under the porch at 29 Neobold Street was here now. Bobby blows me for a dime, it crooned, beginning to climb the fence. It left little pieces of its flesh in the diamond shapes the crisscrossing wires made. The fence jingled and rattled with its weight when it touched the climb, and then vine-like weeds, they turned black. He will do it any time. 15 cents for overtime. Eddie tried to scream. Nothing but a dry, senseless squeak came out of him. His lungs felt like the world's oldest occurrence. He looked down at the ball in his hands, and suddenly blood began to sweat up from between the wrap strings. It patterned to the gravel and splashed on its loafer. He threw it down and took the 2 lunges, stagger steps backwards. His eyes blunged from his face, rubbing his hands on the front of his shirt. The leper had reached the top of the fence. Its head swayed in silhouette against the sky, a nightmare shaped like a bloated Halloween jack-o'-lantern. Its tongue lolled out, 4 feet long, perhaps 6. It twined its way down the fence like a snake from the leper's grinning mouth. There 1 second, gone the next. It did not fade like a ghost in a movie. It simply winked out of existence, but Eddie heard a sound which confirmed its essential. Sonatral, a pop, sound like a cork blowing out of a champagne bottle. It was the sound of air rushing into the filled place where the leper had been. He turned and began to run, but before he had gone 10 feet, 4 shift shapes flew out from the shadows under the loaded bay of the abandoned brick depot. He thought at first they were bats, and he screamed and covered his head. Then he saw that they were squares of canvas, the squares of canvas that had been the bases when the big kids played here. They whirled and twirled in the stale air. He had to duck to avoid one of them. They settled in the air, their accoutrement places all at once, kicking up little puffs of grit. Home, first, second, third, gasping, his breath short in the throat. Eddie ran past home plate, his lips drawn back, his face as white as cottage cheese. Whack! The sound of the bat hitting a phantom ball. And then Eddie stopped, the strength going out of his legs, a groan passing his lips. The ground was plunging in a straight line from home to first, as if a gigantic gropper was tunneling rapidly just below the surface of the ground. Gravel and rolled off to either side. The shape under the earth reached the base, and the canvas flipped up into the air. It went up so hard and fast it made a popping sound. The sound a shoeshine kid makes when he's feeling good and pops the rag. The ground began to ridge between first and second, racing and racing. Second base flew into the air with a similar popping sound and had barely settled back before the shape under the ground had reached third and was racing for home. Home plate flew up as well, but before it could come down, the thing had popped out of the ground like some grisly party favor, and the thing was Tony Tracker, his face a skull, to which a few blackened chunks of flesh still clung. His white shirt a mess of rotted linen strings. He poked out of the earth at home plate from the waist up, swaying back and forth like a gossamer worm. Don't matter how much you choke up on that ash handle, Tony Tracker said in a grinty, grinding voice. Exposed teeth grinned in luminic chunaments. Don't matter, Wheezy. We'll get you. You and your friends will have a ball. Eddie shrieked and distracted away. There was a hand on his shoulder. He shrank away from it. The hand tightened it for a moment, then gave away. He turned. It was Greta Bowie. She was dead. Half of her face was gone. Maggots crawled into church red meat that was left. She had a green balloon in one hand. Car crash. The recognizable half of her mouth said, and grinned. The grin caused an unspeakable ripping sound, and Eddie could see raw tendons moving like terrible straps. I was 18. Eddie drunk and done up on reds. Your friends are here, Eddie. Eddie backed away from her, his hands held up in front of his face. She walked towards him. Blood had splashed, then dried on her legs in long splotches. She was wearing penny loafers, and now, beyond her, he saw the ultimate horror. Patrick Hofstadter was scambling toward him across the outfield. He, too, was wearing a New York Yankees uniform. Eddie ran. Greta clutched at him, again, tearing his shirt and spilling some terrible liquid down the back of his collar. Tony Tracker was pulling himself out of the man-sized gopper run. Patrick Hofstadter stumbled and distracted. Eddie ran, not knowing where he was finding the breath to run, but running somehow anyway. And as he ran, he saw words floating in front of him, the words that had been printed on the side of the green balloon Greta Bowie had been holding, saying, asthma medicine caused lung cancer. Compliments of Center Street drug. Eddie ran. He ran, and at some point he collapsed in a dead faint near McCarran Park, and some kind saw him and steered clear of him because he looked like a winnow to them, like he might have some kind of weird disease. For all they knew, he might even be the killer, and they talked about reporting him to the police, but in the end, they didn't. 3. Ben Rogan pays a call. Beverly walked absently down Main Street from the Derry townhouse, where she had gone to change into a pair of blue jeans and a bright yellow smock blouse. She was not thinking about where she was going. Instead, she thought this. Your hair is winter fire, January embers. My heart burns there too. She had hidden that in her bottom drawer beneath her underwear. Her mother might have seen it, but that was all right. The important thing was that was one drawer her father never looked in. If he had seen it, he might have looked at her with that bright, almost friendly, and utterly paralyzing stare of his and asked, in his almost friendly way, "You've been doing something you shouldn't be doing, Bev. Been doing something with that boy?" And if she said yes, or if she said no, there would be a quick wham-bam, so quick and so hard it didn't even hurt at first. It took a few seconds for the vacuum to dissipate and the pain to feel the place where the vacuum had been. Then his voice again, almost friendly. I worry about you a lot, Beverly. And I worry awful lot. You got to grow up, isn't that so? Her father might still be living here in Derry. He had been living here the last time she had heard from him. But that had been how long ago? 10 years. Long ago she had married Tom. Anyway, she had gotten a postcard from him. Not a plain postcard like the one the poem had been written, one but one showing the hideous plastic statue of Paul Bunyan, which stood in front of city center. The statue had been erected sometimes in the 50s, and it had been one of the landmarks of her childhood. But her father's card had called up no nostalgic or memories for her. It might as well have been a card showing Gateway Arch in St. Louis or the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Hope you are doing well and being good, the card read. Hope you will send me something if you can, as I don't have much time. I love you, Bevy, Dad. He had loved her, and in some ways she supposed that had everything to do with why she had fallen so desperately in love with Bill Deprog that long summer of 1958. Because of all the boys, Bill was the one who projected to sense of authority. She associated with her father, but it was a different sort of authority somehow. It was authority that listened. She saw no aspiration in either his eyes or his action, that he believed her father's kind of worrying to be the only reason authorities needed to exist, as if people were pets, to be both cosseted and plain. Whatever the reason, by the end of their first meeting as a complete group in July of that year, that meeting of which Bill had taken such complete and effortless change, she had been madly head over heels in love with him. Calling it a simple schoolgirl crush was like saying a Rolls Royce was a vehicle with four wheels, something like a hay wagon. She did not giggle widely and blushed when she saw him, nor did she chalk his name on trees or write it on the walls of the Kissing Bridge. She simply lived with his face in her heart all the time, a kind of sweet, hurtful ache. She would have died for him. It was natural enough, she supposed, for her to want to believe it had been Bill who sent her the love poem, although she had never got so far gone as to actually convince her it was so. No, she had known who wrote the poem, and later on, at some point, hadn't its author admitted this to her? Yes, Ben had told her so, although she could not now remember, not for the life of her, just when or other what circumstances he had actually said it out loud, and although his love for her had been almost as well hidden as the love she had felt for Bill. But you told him, Bevy, you told him you loved. It was obvious to anyone who really looked and who was kind. It was in the way he was also careful to keep some space between them in the draw of his breath when she touched his arms or his hand, and the way he dressed when he knew he was going to see her. Dear, sweet, fat Ben. It had ended it somehow, that difficulty pre-association triangle. But just how it had ended it was one of the things she still couldn't remember. She thought that Ben had confused authoritarian and sent in the little love poem. She thought she had told Bill she loved him, that she would love him forever, and somehow those two tellings had helped saved all their lives. Or had they? She couldn't remember these memories or memories of memories that was really closer to what they were like islands that were not really islands at all, but only knobs of a single coral spine which happened to poke up above the waterline, not separated at all, but one piece. Yet whatever she tried to dive deep and see the rest in maddening image intervened. The grackles which come back each spring to New England, crowding the telephone line, trees and rooftops jostling for places and filling the tawny late March air with their rotten gossip. This image came to her again and again, forges in disturbance, like a heavy radio beam that blankets that single you really want to pick up. She realized with sudden shock that she was standing outside of Clint's clothes washery, where she and Stan Uris and Ben and Eddie had taken the rags that day in the late June, rags stained with blood which only they could see. The windows were now soaked, a quain, and there was a hand letter for sale, by owner's sign taped to the door. Peering between the swashes of soap, she could see in an empty room with lighter squares on the dirt yellow walls, where the washers had stood. I'm going home, she thought dismissively, but walked on away. Anyway, this neighborhood hadn't changed much. A few more of the trees were gone, probably elms, felled by disease. The houses looked a little tackier. Broken windows seemed slightly more common than they had been when she was a girl. Some of the broken pans had been replaced with cardboard. She hadn't. And here she stood in front of the apartment house, 127 Lower Main Street, still here. The peeling white she remembered had become a peeling chocolate brown at some point during the years between, but it was still unmistakable. There was the window, which locked in on what had been there at the kitchen. There was the window of her bedroom. Jem Doya, you come out of that road. Come out right now. You want to run over and killed? He shivered, hugging her arms across her breast in an X, cupping her elbows in her palm. Daddy could still be living here. Oh, yes, he could. He wouldn't move unless he had to. Just walked on up there. Beverly looked at the mailboxes, free boxes for free apartments, just like the old days. And if there's one which says Marsh, you can ring the bell, and pretty soon there'll be the shuffle of slippers down the hall, and the door will open, and you can look at him. The man, Wo Sperm, made you rebranded and left-handed and gave you the ability to draw. Remember how he used to draw? He could draw anything he wanted it, if he felt like it. That is, he didn't feel like it often. I guess he had too many things to worry about. But when he did, you used to sit for hours and watch while he drew cats and dogs and horses and cows with moo coming out of their mouths and balloons. You'd laughed, and he'd laughed, and then he'd laughed, say, now you, Bevy. And when you held the pen, he'd guide your hand, and you'd seen the cow or the cat or the smiling man unspooled beneath your own fingers, while you smelled his men's skin bracer and wanted the warmth of his skin. Go on up, Beverly. Ring the bell. He'll come, and it'll be old. The lines will be drawn deep in his face and his teeth. Those that there are left will be yellow, and he'll look at you. He'll say, why, it's Bevy. Bevy's come home to see her old dad. Come on in, Bevy. I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad because I worry about you, Bevy. I worry about you a lot. She walked slowly up the path, and the weeds growing up between the cracked concerned sections brushed at the legs of her jeans. She looked closely at the first floor window, but there were curtains off. She looked at the mailbox, third floor, Starkweather, second floor, Burke, first floor. Her breath caught. Marsh. But I won't ring. I don't want to see him. I don't want to ring the bell. This was a firm decision at last, the decision that opened in the gate to a full and useful lifetime of firm decisions. She walked down the path, back to downtown, up to Darien House. Packed cab flew, told Tom to bug out, lived successfully, died happily. Rang the bell. She heard the familiar chimes from the living room, chimes that had always sounded to her like a Chinese man. Ching-chong. Singless, no answer. She shifted on the porch, from the one foot to the other, suddenly needing to pee. No one home. She thought, relieved, I can go now. Instead, she rang. Ching-chong. No answer. She thought of Ben's lovely little poem and tried to remember exactly when and how he had confused its authorship, and why for a brief second it's called up in association with having her first residential period. Had she begun Miss Journey at 11? Surely not, although her breasts had begun their first achy growth around midwinter. Why? Then inventoried a mental picture of thousands of grackles on phone lines and rooftops, all blabbing of a white spring sky. I'll leave now. I'll rung twice. That's enough. But she rang again. Ching-chong. Now she heard someone approaching, and sound was just as she had imagined, the tried whisper of old slippers. She looked around widely and came very, very close to just talking to her heels. She and could she make it down to the cement, walking around the corner, leaving her father to think it had been nothing but kids playing pranks? Hey, mister, you got Prince Albert in a can? She let out a sudden sharp breath and had to tighten her throat because that wanted to come out was a laugh of relief. It was her father at all, standing in the door, and looking out at her was a tall woman in her late 70s. Her hair was long and gorgeous, mostly white, but shot through with loads of purest gold. Behind her rimless, spectreless, her eyes as blue as the winter in the foreheads her actress had perhaps hailed. She wore a purple dress of water and slick. It was shabby, but still defiant. Her wrinkled face was kind. Yes, miss? Oh, sorry, Beverly said. The urge to laugh had passed as swiftly as it had come. She noticed that the old woman wore a cameo at her throat. It was almost certainly real ivory, surrounded by a band of gold, so it fit very nearly invisibly. I must have rung the wrong bell, or rang the wrong bell on purpose. Her mind whispered, I meant to ring for Marsh. Marsh? Her forehead wrinkled declaringly. Yes, you see, there's no Marsh here, the old woman said. But unless you don't mean Alvis Marsh, do you? Yes, Beverly said. That's my father. The old woman's hand rose to the cameo and touched it. She peered more closely at Beverly, making her feel ridiculously young, as if she should perhaps have a box of Girl Scout cookies in her hand, or maybe some tags support the Derry High School Tigers. Then the old woman smiled a kind of smile that nonetheless sad. Why, you have fallen out of touch, miss. I don't want to be the one who tells you this a stranger, but your father has been dead these last 5 years. But on the bell she looked again. Another small relief sound that was not quite a life in her action, in her supplications, but rock solid, certainly, that her old man would still be here. And she had read Cash as Marsh. You're Mrs. Cash? She asked. She was staggered by this news of her father, but she also felt stupid about the mistake. The lady would think about her little more than intelligence. Mrs. Cash, she agreed. You did know my dad. Very little did I know him, Mr. Cash said. She sounded a little like Yoda in the Empire Strikes Back, and Beverly felt like laughing again. When had her emotions gone responding so violent back and forth? And truth was she couldn't remember a time, but she was dismally afraid she would before much longer. He rented the ground apartment before me. We saw each other, me coming, and him going over a space of few days. He moved down to Roadward Lane. Do you know it? Yes, Beverly said. Roadward Lane branched off from Lower Main Street 4 blocks farther down, where the apartment buildings were smaller and even more desperately shabby. I used to see at the Castro Avenue Market sometimes, Mrs. Cash said, and I had the washroom before they closed it. We passed a word from time to time. Wee girl, you're pale. I'm sorry. Come in and let me give you a tea. No, I couldn't, Beverly said weakly, but in fact she actually felt pale, like cloudy glass that you could nearly look through. She could use tea and a chair in which to sit and drink it. You could and you will, Mrs. Cash said warmly. It's the least I can do for having told you such unpleasant news. Before she could protest, Beverly found herself being led up the gloomy hall and into her old apartment, which now seemed much smaller, but safe enough. Safe, she supposed before, because almost everything was different. Instead of the pink top, formerly table with its 3 chairs, there was a small round table, really not much bigger than table, with slick flowers in a pottery vase instead of the old Calverter refrigerator with the round drum on top. Her father tinkered with it constantly to keep it going. There was a copper-colored refrigerant. The stove was small but effeminate looking. There was an AMA radar range above it, bright blue curtains hanged in the windows, and she could see flower boxes outside them. The floor in Nolan, when she was a girl here, had been stripped to its original wood. Many applications of oil made it glow, mellowing. Mrs. Kresh looked around from the stove, where she was placing a teapot. You grew up here. Yes, Beverly said. But it's very different now, so trim and tidy. Wonderful. How kind you are, Mrs. Kresh said, and her smile made her younger. It was radiant. I have a little money, you see. Not much, but with my Social Security I am comfortable. Once I was a girl in Sweden. I came to this country in 1920, a girl of 14 with no money, which is the best way to learn the value of money. Would you agree? Yes, Bev said. At the hospital I worked, Mrs. Kresh said. Many years from 1925. I worked there. I rose to the position of head housekeeper. All the keys I had. My husband invested our money quite well. Now I have reached a little harbor. Looked around, missed, while the water boils. No, I couldn't. Please, I feel guilty. Look if you like. And so she did. Her parents' bedroom was now Mrs. Kesh's bedroom, and the difference was profound. The room seemed brighter and airier now. A large cinder chest, the intentional RG inlaid into it, breathed its gentle armoro into the air. A gigantic surprise lay on the bed. On it she could see women drawing water, boys driving cattle, men building haystacks, a wonderful quilt. Her room had become a sewing room. A black singer machine stood on a iron table under a pair of sparkling FFX 10 soar lamps. A picture of Jesus hung on one wall. A picture of John F. K. on another. A beautiful break font stood below the picture of JFK Stadium. It was filled with books instead of china, but seemed more the worse for that. She went into the bathroom last. It had been redomed in a rose color that was too low and pleasant to seem grody. All of the fixtures were new, and yet she approached the basin, feeling that the old nightmare had gripped her again. She would peer down into the black and lidless. The whispering would begin, and then the blood. She leaned over the sink, clutching a glimpse of her pallid face and dark eyes in the mirror over the basins. And then she started into that eye, waiting for the voices, the laughter, the groans, the blood. How much might she have stood there, bent over the sink, waiting for the sights and sounds? 27 years gone. She didn't know. It was Mrs. Kesher's voice that bid her return. Tea, miss. She jerked back, the semi-hypothesis broken, and left the bathroom. If there had been dark magic somewhere down in that drain, it was gone now, or was sleeping. Oh, you shouldn't have. Mrs. Kresh looked up at her brightly, smiling a little. Oh, miss, if you knew how Santa Motor Company calls these days, you'd not say so. Why, I put on more than this for the man from the Bangor Hondro, who comes to read my meteor. I'm making him fat. Declined cups and saucers stood on the round kitchen table, a clean bone, white-edged with blue. There was a plate of small cakes and cookies beside the sweet and pateur teapot, chuffed, mild stream, and pleasant fragments. Bemused, Bev thought that the only things missing were the tiny sandwiches with the curses cut off. Outstanding witches, she thought. Them, always one word. 3 main types of ant sandwiches. Cream cheese in olive, watercress, and egg salad. Sit down, said Mrs. Kresh. Sit down, miss, and I'll pour you out. I'm not a miss, Beverly said, and raised her left hand so that her ring would show. Mrs. Kresh smiled and pushed a hand through the air. Prosh, the jester said. I call all the pretty young girls, miss, he said. Just a habit. Don't take offense. No, Beverly said. Not at all. None taken. but for some reason she felt a fatter touch of unease. There was something in the old woman's smile that had seemed a little, unpleasant, false, knowing, but that was ridiculous, wasn't it? I love what you've done to place, do you? Mrs. Crash said and poured out. The tea looked dark, muddy. Beverly wasn't sure she wanted to drink, and suddenly she wasn't sure she wanted to be here at all. It did say Marsh under the doorbell. Her mind whispered suddenly, and she was frightened. Mrs. Crash passed her tea. Thank you, Beverly. The look of it might have been muddy. The amaranth, however, was wonderful. As she tasted, it was fine. Stop jumping at shadows. She told herself that cinder chest, in particular, it was a wonderful piece. And quit that one, Mrs. Crash said, and laughed. Beverly noticed that the old woman's beauty was foaled on only one score, and that was common enough here in the Northlands. Her teeth were very bad, strong looking, but bad all the same. There were yellow, and the front, too, had crossed each other. The candy seemed very long, also lacked tusk. There were white when she came to the door. She smiled, and you thought to yourself how white they were. Suddenly she was not a little frightened. Suddenly she needed to be away from here. Very old. Oh, yes, Mrs. Crash examined and drank her cup of tea off a single gulp with a sudden shock and slurping sound. She smiled at Beverly, grinned at her, and Beverly saw that the woman's eyes had changed too. The corns were now yellow and clint, Ferdinand, with burly snitches of red. Her hair was thinner. The braid looked motionlessly, no longer silver shot with bright yellow, but a dull gray. Very old. Mrs. Crash Mixins over her empty cup, looking silently at Beverly from her yellowed eyes. Her snaggled teeth and showed in that repulsing, almost linear grin. From home with me came the R.G. craved into it. You notice, yes, her voice come from far away, and a part of her brain yammered. If she doesn't know you've seen the change, perhaps you're still all right. If she doesn't see. My father, she said, pronouncing it fatter. And Beverly saw that her dress had also changed. It had become a scabrous, peeling black. The cameo was a skull. Its jaw hug is a deceased gape. His name was Robert Gray, better known as Bob Gray, better known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown, although that was not his name either, but he did love his joke, my father. She laughed again. Some of her teeth had turned as black as her dress, the wrinkles in her skin, now cup deep. Her milk rose skin had gone a slicky yellow. Her fingers were claws. She grinned at Beverly. Have something to eat, dear? Her voice had risen half an octave, but the octave was cracked, and as registered in her voice was the sound of a cracked door swinging mindlessly on hinges clogged with black earth. No, thank you, Beverly heard her mouth say in a child's high, oh, I must be going voice. The words did not see the organite in her brain, rather than come out of her mouth, and then had to travel around to her ears before she was aware of what she had said. No, the witch asked and grinned. Her claws scrabbled on the plates, and she began to cram the thin, mossy cookies and delicate, frosted slices of cake into her mouth with both hands. Her horrid teeth plunged and reared. Her fingernails, long and dirty, dug into her sweat's crumbs, tumbled down the bony slabs of her chin. Her breath was the smell of long dead things burst wide open by the gases of their own decay. Her laugh was now a dead cackle. Her hair was thinner, scantling scalp shone in patches. Oh, he loved his... my fatter, this is a joke, miss. If you enjoyed them, my fatter born me router than my mother. He shot him from his asshole. He. I ought to go, Beverly heard her say in that same high, wounded voice, the voice of a small girl who was been viciously embarrassed at her first party. There was no strength in her legs. She was dimly aware that it was not tea in her cup, but shit. Liquid shit, a little party favor from the sewers under the city. She had drunk some of that, not much but the sip. Oh, God, Oh God, oh bless Jesus, please, please. The woman was shrinking before her eyes, finning it. It was now a crone with an apple's and doll's face, who sat across from her, giggling in a high squealing voice and rocking back and forth. Oh, my father and I are one, she said. Just me, just him. And dear, if you are wise, you will run. Run back to where you came from. Run quickly, because to stay will mean worse than your death. No one who dies in Derry really dies. You know that before, believe it now. In slow motion, Beverly gathered her legs under her, as if from outside she saw herself gaining her feet and backing away from the table and from the witch in the agony of horror and disbelief. Disbelief because she realized for the first time that the neat little dining room table was not dark oak but fudge, even as she watched. The witch still giggled, her ancient yellow eyes slanted slyly off into the corner of the room, broke a piece of it, and stuffed it avowedly into the black ring trap. And that was her mouth. The cups she saw were white bark that had been carefully looped with blue dyed frosting. The pictures of Jesus and John Kinnanen were creations of nearly transparent spun sugar, and as she looked at them, Jesus stuck out his tongue, and Kinnanen dropped a stinky wink. We're all waiting for you, the witch screamed, and her fingernails scrambled over the surface in the fudge table, drawing deep scars in its shining surface. Oh, yes, oh, yes. The overhead lights were globes of hard candy, and wainscoting was caramel taffy. She looked down and saw that her shoes were leaving prints of the floorboards, which were not boards at all, but slices of chocolate that smelled like candy. Was Chloe. Oh, God, it's Hansel and Gretel. It's the witch, the one that always scared me, the worst because she ate the children. And you and your friends, the witch screamed, laughing. You and your friends in the cage until the oven's hot. She screamed laughter, and Beverly ran for the door. But she ran in slow motion. The witch's laugh beat and swirled around her head, a cloud of bats. Beverly shrank. The halls stank of sugar and nougat and toffee, and stuck in strawberries. The doorknob, mock crystal, when she came in, was a monstrosity sugared diamond. I worry about you, Beverly. I worry about you a lot. She turned. Swirls of red hair floating around her to see her father straggling toward her down the hallway, wearing the witch's black dress and skull cameo. Her father's face hung with doughy running flesh, his eyes as black as obsidian, his hands clutching and unclutching, his mouth grinning with soapy fever. I beat you because I want to fuck you, Bevy. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to fuck you. I wanted to eat you. I wanted to eat your pussy. I wanted to suck your clit up between my teeth. Yum, 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 Beverly. Oh, yummy. I want to put you in a cage and get the oven hot and feel your cunt. Your plumped cunt. And when it was plump enough to eat. Screaming, she grasped the sticky doorknob and bolted out onto the porch. That was disordered with praline doodads and floored with fudge far away, dim, seeming to swim in her vision. She saw cars passing back and forth, and a woman pushing a careful of groceries back from Costello. I have to get out of here, she thought, just barely Culverherton. That's reality out there. If I can only get out of the sidewalk, won't do you any good to run, Bevy, her father. My father told her, laughing. We've been waiting a long time for this. This is going to be fun. This is going to be yummy in our tummies. She looked back at it again, and her dead father was not wearing the witch's back dress, but the clown suit was the big orange buttons. There was a 1958 Coonskin cap, the kind of popularity spine Fess Parker in the Disney movie about Davy Crockett perched on its head. In one hand, it held a bunch of balloons. In the other, it held the leg of a child, like a chicken drumstick. Written on the balloon was the legend. It came from outer space. Tell your friends I am the last of dying race, it said. grinning its sunken grin as it staggered and lunged down the porch steps after her, the only savior of a dying planet. I have come to robe all the woman, raped all the man, and learned to do peppermint twist. It began to do a mad shuck and jive, balloons in one hand, servered bleeding leg in the other. The clown costume writted and flapped, but Beverly felt no wind. Her legs tangled in each other, and she spilled to the pavement, throwing out her palms to take up the shock, which went all the way into her shoulders. The woman pushing the grocery cart paused and looked back doubtfully, then hurried on a little faster. The clown came toward her again, casting the served leg aside. It landed on the lawn with an indarkenable thud. Beverly only laid sprawled on the pavement for a moment, sure somewhere inside that she must wake soon. This couldn't be real. Had to be a dream. She realized that wasn't true for a moment before the clown cooked, long clawed, fingers touched her. It was real. It could kill her, as if it had killed the children. The crackles known her real name, she screamed at it suddenly. It recoiled. And it seemed to her that for a moment the grin on the lips inside the great red grin that had been painted on and around them become a grimace of hate and pain, and perhaps of fear as well. It might only have been her imagination, and she certainly had no idea why she had said such a crazy thing, but it fought her in an instant of time. She was on her feet and running. Brake squealed in a hoarse voice. Both mad and scared, yelled, "Why don't you look where you're going, you dumb quiff?" She had a burl impression of a bakery truck that had almost hit her when she bolted into the street like a child after a rubber ball, and then she was standing on the opposite sidewalk, painting a hot snitch in her left side. The bakery truck went on down Lower Main. The clown was gone. The leg was gone. The house still stood there, but she saw now that it was crumbled and deserted, the windows boarded up, the steps leading up to the porch cracked and broken. Was I really in there, or did I dream it all? But her jeans were dirty, her yellow blouse smeared with dust, and there was chocolate on her fingers. She rubbed them on the legs of her jeans and walked away fast, her face hot, her back cold as ice, her eyeballs seeming to pulse in and out, and with a rapid thud of her heart. We can't beat it. Whatever it is, we can't beat it. It even was us to try. It wants to settle the old score. Can't be happen with a draw, I guess. We out to get out of here. Just leave. Something burst against her clef, lights as a cat's questioning pause. She jerked away from a little shrink. She looked down and cringed, one hand against her paw. It was a mouth. It was a balloon, as yellow as her blouse, written on the side of it in the electric blue with the words, "That's wait, wabbit." As she watched it was bouncing lightly up the street, urged the pleasant late spring breeze. Dun-dun-dun-dun. 4. Richie Tozier makes tracks. Well, there was the day Henry and his friends chased me before the end of school. This was. Richie was walking along Outer Canal Street past Bazzi Park. Now he stopped, hands stuffed in his pocket, looking forward to the Kissin' Bridge, but not really seeing it. I got away from them in the toy department of Friesen's. Since the mad conclusion of the reunion lunch, he had been walking aimlessly, trying to make his peace with the awful things which had been in a fortune cookies, with the things which had seemed to be in the cookies. He thought that most likely nothing at all had come of them. It had been a group hallucinations brought on by all the spooky shit they had been talking about. The best proof on the hypothesis was that Rose had been seen nothing at all. Of course, Beverly's parents had never seen any of the blood that came out of the bathroom drain either. But this wasn't the same. No, why not? Because we're grown-ups now, he muttered, and discovered the thought had absolutely no power or logic at all. It might as well have been a nonsense line from a kid's skip ropes chant. He started to walk again. I went up by City Center and sat down on the park bench for a while, and I thought I saw. He stopped again, frowning. Saw what? But that was just something I dreamed. Was it? Was it really? He looked to the left and saw the big glass brick and steel building that had looked so modern in the late 50s and now looked rather antiquated and tacky. And here I am, he thought, right back to fucking City Center, scene of that utter hallucination or dream or whatever it was. The others saw him as the class clown, the crazy cut-up, and he had fallen neatly, easily into the role again. Ah, he all fell neatly and easily back into our old roles again. Didn't you notice? But was there anything very unusual about that? He thought you would probably see much the same thing at any 10th or 20th high school reunion. The class comedian who had discovered a vocation for the priesthood in the college would, after 2 drinks, revert almost automatically into the wise carry. He had been the great English brain who had wound up with a GM truck dealership, would suddenly begin spouting off about John Iverin or John Cleverin, the guy who had played with the Moondogs on Saturday nights and who had gone on to begin a mathematics professor at Cornell, would suddenly find himself on stage with the band, a Fender guitar strapped over his shoulder, whopping Gloria or stuffing birds with gleeful, drunken furiosity. What was it Springton said? No retreat, baby, no surrender. But it was easier to believe in the oldies on the record player after a couple of drinks or some pretty good Pamela Red. But Richie believed it was a reversion. That was the hallucination, not the present life. Maybe the child was the father of the man, but fathers and sons often share very different interests in only a passing resemblance. But you said grown-ups, and now it sounds like nonsense. It sounds like no much biddle babble. Why is that, Richie? Why? Because Derry is as weird as ever. Why don't we just leave it at that? Because things wasn't that simple. That was why. As a kid, he had been a goof-off, and he sometimes Virgil sometimes, amusing comedians. Because it was one to get along without getting killed by kids like Henry Bowers or going absolutely Looney Tunes with boredom and loneliness. He realized now that a lot of the problems had been his own mind, which was usually moving at a speed 10 or 20 times that of his classmates, that they had thought him strange, weird, or even suicidal, depending on the escape did in question, but maybe it had been a simple case of mental overdrive. If anything about being in constant mental overdrive was simple, anyway, it was the sort of things you got under control. After a while, you got it under control or you found outlets for it. Guys like Kinky Briefcase or Bufford Kiss Drivel. For instance, Richie had discovered that in the months after he had wandered into the college radio station pretty much on a whim and had discovered everything. He had everyone to during his first week behind the microphone. He hadn't been very good at first. He had been too excited to be good, but he had understood his potential not to be just good at the job, but great at it, and just that knowledge had been enough to put him over the moon on a cloud of Iraporia. At the same time, he had begun to understand the great principle that moved the university, at least that part of the universe, which had to do with careers and success. He found the crazy guy who was running around inside of you, fucking up your life. You chased him into the corner and grabbed him, but you didn't kill him. Oh no, killing was too good for the likes of that little bastard. You put a harness over his head and then started plowing. The crazy guy worked like a demon. Once you had him in a trace and he supplied you with a few chunks from time to time. That was really all there was, and that was enough. He had been funny, all right, a laugh a minute, but in the end he had outgrown the nightmares, but were on the dark side of all those laughs, or he thought he had until today, when the words grown up suddenly stopped making sense to his own ears, and now now here it was something else to cope with, or at least think about. Here was the huge and total idiotic statue of Paul Bunyan in front of City Center. I must be the expectation that proves the rules, Big Bill. Are you sure there was nothing, Richie? Nothing at all. Up by City Center, I thought I saw sharp pain needled at his eye for the second time that day, and he clutched at them, and startled moan coming out of him. Then it was gone again as quickly as it had come. But he had also smelled something, hadn't he? Something that wasn't really there, but something that had been there, something that made him think of. I'm right here with you, Richie. Hold my hand. Can you catch hold? Mike Hanlon. It was smoke that had made his eyes sting and water 27 years ago. They had breathed that smoke. In the end, there had just been Mike and himself left, and they had seen, but it was gone. He looked. He took a step closer to the plastic Paul Bunyan statue, as amazed by its cheerful vulnerable now as he had been overwhelmed by its size as a child. The mythical Paul stood 20 feet high, and the base added another 6 feet. He stood smiling down at the car and person traffic on Outer Canal Street from the edge of the city City Center had been erected in the years 1954 to 55 for a minor Legends basketball team that had never majorized. The Derry City Chronicle had voted money for the statue a year later in 1956. It had been hotly debated both in the Chronicle's public meetings and in the letters to the editor columns of the Derry News. Many thought it would be a perfect, lovely statue, certain to become a tourist attraction of note. There were others who found the idea of a plastic Paul Bunyan horrible garbage and unbelievably gotch. The art teacher at Derry High School, which he remembered, had written a letter to the News saying that if such a monstrosity were actually to be erected in Derry, she would blow it up. Grin and Richie wondered if that babe's contract had been renewed. The controversy, which Richie recognized now as an utterly typical big town / small city tempest in a teapot, had ragged for 6 months, and of course it had been entirely meaningless. The statue had been purchased, and even if the City Chronicle had done something as Apernern, especially for New England, as decided not to use an item for which money had been paid, where's in God's name could it have been stored? Then the statue, not really sculptural at all, but simply cast in some Ohio plastic plants, had been set in place, still surrounded in a whack of canvas big enough to serve as a clipper ship's sail. It had been unveiled on May 13th, 1957, which was the unincorporated township 115th birthday. One faction gave voice to predictable moans of outrage, the other to equally predictable moans of rapture. When Paul was revealed that day, he was wearing his bib overalls and a red and white check shirt. His beard was suspendedly black, suspendedly full, suspendedly lumberjacked. A plastic eye, surely the Godzilla of all plastic axes, was slung over one shoulder, and he'd grinned uneasily at the north skies, which on the day of the unevelin had been as blue as the skin of Paul's reputed companion. Babe was not present at the unevelin. However, the cost median of adding a blue ox to the tableau had been provided. The children who attended the ceremonies, there were hundreds of them, and 10-year-old Richie Tozier in the company of his dad had been among them, were totally and unconcernedly delighted by the plastic giant. Parents boosted toddlers up onto the square partition on which Paul stood, took photos, and then watched with mixed apprehensions and amusement as the kids climbed and crawled laughing over Paul's huge black boots. Correction, huge black plastic boots. It had been March of the following year when Richie, exhausted and terrified, had finished up on one of the benches in front of the statue, after including by the barest of Magerns, Messer and Bowers, Chris and Huggins, and a chase that had led from Derry Elementary School across most of the town area. He had finally ditched them in the toy department of Friesen's department store. A Derry branch of Friesen's was a poor thing compared with the grand downtown department store in the bagger, but Richie had been far past caring about such thing. By then, it was a case of any port. Richie had been flagging badly. He had dodged into the mouth of the department store's revolving door as a last resort. Henry, who apparently didn't understand the physics of such device, had nearly lost the tips of his fingers, trying to grab Richie as Richie tuttling around and into the door, pelting downstairs, shirt tail flying out behind him. He had heard the revolving door give off a series of reports almost as loud as TV gunfires, and understood that Larry, Moe, and Curly were still after him. He was laughing as he went down the stairs to the basement level, but that was only a nervous tick. He was as full of terror as a rabbit caught in a wire snare. They really meant to beat him up good this time. He had no idea that in another 10 weeks or so he would believe the three of them, Henry in particular, capable of anything short of murder, and he surely would have Whittington with shock if he had known of the apocalyptic rock fight in July, when even that last qualification would disappear from his mind. And the whole thing had been so utterly typically stupid. Richie and the other boys in his fifth grade class had been filling into the gym. A sixth grade class, Henry Holken among them, like an ox among cows, had been coming out. Although he was still in the fifth grade, Henry went to the gym with the older boys. The overhead pipes had been dripping again, and Mr. Fazio hadn't yet gotten around to putting up his cautioning "wet floor" sign on its little easel. Henry had slipped in a puddle and had landed on his keister. Before he could stop it, Richie's chater mouth aunt had buggled, "Way to go, Banana Heels." There had been an explosion of laughter from both Henry's classmates and Richie's, but there had been no laughter on Henry's face as he picked himself up, only a dull flush the color of freshly fired brick. "Later for you, Four Eyes," he said, and walked on. The laughter died at once. The boys in the hall looked at Richie as one already dead. Henry did not pause to check reactions. He simply walked off, head down, elbows red from catching the fall, a large wet place on the seat of his pants. Looking at that wet spot, Richie felt his suicidally witted mouth drop open again. But this time he snapped it shut again so fast he almost apertured the tip of his tongue with the fallen gay of his teeth. "Well, but he'll forgot," he told himself uneasily as he changed for Jim. "Sure he will. Old Hanks just hasn't got that many memory circuits working. Every time he takes a shit, he probably has to look up the directions in the instructions booklet." "Ha ha, ha ha, you're dead, trash mouth, Vince Boogers," Talio told him, pulling his jock up over a dork roughly the size and shape of an American peanut. He said it with certain sad respect. "Don't worry, though. I'll bring flowers. Cut off your ears and bring cauliflowers." Richie had come back smartly, and everyone laughed, even old Boogers Tunnelin laughed. Why not? They could all afford to laugh. What? Me worried. They would all be home watching Jimmy Dodd and the Musketeers on the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, or Frank Lemon singing "I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent" on American Bandstand, while Richie went shagging ass through ladies' littering and housewares on his way to the toy department, with sweat pouring down his back into the crack of his ass and his terrified balls strung up so high they felt like they might be hung to only his belly button. Sure, they could laugh. Hardy har har har. Henry hadn't forgotten. Richie had helped by the door at the kindergarten end of the school building just in case, but Henry had stuck Belch Huggins there also just in case. Hardy har har har. Richie saw Belch first toward there. Would have been no confidence at all. Belch was looking out toward Dairy Park, holding an unlit cigarette in one hand and dreamily picking the seat of the chin nose on out of his ass with the other, heart pounding hard. Richie had walked quietly across the playground and was most of the way down Charter Street before Belch turned his head and saw him. He yelled for Henry and Victor, and since then the chase had been on. When Richie reached the toy department, it had been utterly, horribly deserted. There wasn't even a sales clerk hanging out, a welcome adult to put a stop to things before they got entirely out of hand. He could hear the free dinosaurs of the apocalypse closing in now, and he simply couldn't run anymore. Each breath produced a deep hurting snitch in his left side. His eyes fixed on a door which read emergency exit only. Alarm will sound. Hoped kindly in his chest. Richie ran down, and Eisel crammed with Donald Duck, Jack in the Boxes, United States Army, tanks made in Japan, Lone Ranger cap, pistols, wind up, robots. He reached the door and slammed the push bar as hard as he could. The door opened, letting in cool mid-March air. The alarm went off with a strident bray. Richie immediately doubled back and dropped it to his hands and his knees. In the next aisle over, he was down before the door could settle closed again. Henry belched and Victor thundered into the toy department just as the door clicked shut and the alarm cut off. They raced for it, Henry in the lead, his face set in the tent. A sales clerk finally appeared coming on the run. He wore blue Illan dusters over a plaid sport coat of extraordinary ugliness. The rims of his spectacles were as pink as the eyes of a white rabbit. Richie thought he looked like Wally Cox in his Mr. Peepers role, and he had to slam his traitor mouth into the fat part of his forearms to keep from screaming out gales of exhausting laughter. "You boys," Mr. Peepers examined, "you boys can't go out there. That's an emergency exit. Hey, you boys." Victor glanced at him a little nervously, but Henry and Belch never turned from their course, and Victor followed them. The alarm brayed again, longer this time, as they charged into the alley. Before it stopped clanging, Richie was on his feet and trouting back toward ladies lingering. "You boys will be barred from the store," the clerk yelled after him. Looking back over his shoulder, Richie squealed in his granny grunt voice. "Did anyone ever tell you you look just like Mr. Peepers, young man?" So he had escaped. And so he had finished up also a mile from Freeze's in front of city center, and he developed hoped are of harm's ways, at least for the time being. He was spent. He sat down on the bench just to left, on the Paul Boehm statue, wanting to only a little peace. While he got himself back together, in a bit he would get up and head home. But for you now it felt too good to just sit there in the afternoon sun. The day had opened in a cold drizzly gloom, but now you could believe spring might actually be on the way. Farther up the lawn, he could see the city center mandarin, which on that March day borne this message in large blue translate letters: "Hey teens, coming March 28th, the Aaron Woo Ginsberg Rock and Roll Show. Jerry Lee Lewis, the Penguins, Frankie Luminen, and the teenagers, Jin Vincent, and the Blue Caps, Freddie Boom Boom Cannon. An evening of wholesome entertainment." That was a show Richie really wanted to see, but he knew there wasn't a chance. His mother's ideas of a wholesome entertainment did not include Jerry Lee Lewis telling the young people of America, "We got chicken in the barn." Whose barn? What barn? My barn. Not for that matter did it include Freddie Cannon, whose tales Hassan lesson that in a hi-fi classes there she was willing to admit that she had done her share of screaming for Frank Sinatra. Whom she now called Frankie the Snot as a Bobby Soxer. But like Bill Debrog's mother, she was deaf on rock and roll. Chuck Berry terrified her, and she declared that Richard Penniman, better known this is teen and sub-teen Copasusan as Lil Richard, made her want to barf like a chicken. This was a praise for Richie, what Richie had never asked a translation. His dad was natural on the subject of rock and roll and could perhaps have been swanned, but Richie knew in his heart that his mother's wishes would roll on his subjects until he was 16 or 17 anyway, and by then His mother was firmly convicted. The country's rock and roll mania would have passed. Richie thought Danny and the Juniors were more right on that subject than his mom. Rock and roll would never die. He himself loved it, although his sources were really only two American Bandstand on Channel 7 in the afternoon and WMX out of Boston at night. When the air had thin and the hoarse, enthusiastic voice of Arden Ginsberg came wavering in and out, like the voice of a ghost called up at the seance. The beat did more than make him happy. It made him feel bigger, stronger. More there when Frankie Ford sang Sea Cruise or Eddie Contrick sang Summertime Blues. Richie was actually transported with joy. There was power in that music, a power which seemed to most rightfully belong to all the skinny kids, fat kids, ugly kids, shy kids, the world's loser. In short, he felt a mad, hilarious voltage which had the power to both kill and exile. He idealistic Fats Dominoes, who made even Ben Hanscom slim and trim, and Buddy Holly, who liked Richie, wore glasses, and Screamin' Jay Hawkins, who popped out of a coffin at his concerts, or so Richie had been told, and the Dovells, who danced as good as black guys. Well, almost. He would have his rock and roll someday. If he wanted it, he was confident it would still be there for him when his mother finally gave in and let him have it. But that would not be on March 28, 1958, or 1959, or his eyes had drifted anyway from the macaron, and then he must have fallen asleep. It was the only explanation that made sense, that what had happened next could only happen in dreams. And now, here he was again, a Richie Tozier who had finally gotten all the rocks and roll he had ever wanted it, and who had found, happily, that it was still wasn't enough. His eyes went on the Mariquin in front of the city center and saw that, with a hideous kind of sclerodipsies, those same blue letters spelled out. June 14, Heavy Metal Mania, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden. Buy your tickets here or at any Tickerin outlet. Somewhere along the way, they dropped the wholesome entertainment line, but as far as I can tell, that's just about the only difference. Richie fought and heard Danny and the Juniors, dim and distant, like voices heard down a long corridor coming out of a cheap radio. Rock and roll will never die. I'll dig it to the end. I'll go down in history. Just you. Watch my friend. Richie looked back at Paul Bunyan, patron saint of Derry, which had come into being according to the stories, because this was where the logs fetched up when they came down river. There had been a time when in the springs both the Penobscots and the Kensduck would have been solid logs from the one side to the other, their black bark hides glistening in the spring sun. A fellow who was fast on his feet would walk from Wally Spa and Hell's Half Race over to Rampers in Brewster. Rampers was a tavern of such horrible repute that it was commonly called the Bucket of Blood, without getting his boots wet over the third crossing of his raw-hide lances, or so it had been storied in Richie's youth, and he supposed there was a bit of Paul Bunyan in all such stories. Old Paul, he thought, looking up at the plastic statue. What you been doing since I've been gone? Made any new riverbeds? Coming home tired and dragging your axe behind you? Made any new lakes on account of what's in a bathtub big enough so you could sit in water up to your neck? Scared any more little kids the way you scared me that day? Ah, and suddenly he remembered it all, the way you will sometimes suddenly remember a word which has been dancing on the tip of your tongue. There he had been, sitting in that mellow March sunshine, drowsing a little, thinking about going home and catching the last half hour of bandstand. And suddenly there had been a warm swash of air into his face. It blew his hair back from his forehead. He looked up, and Paul Bunyan's huge plastic face had been right in front of his, bigger than a face on a movie screen, filling everything. The rush of air had been caused by Paul's bending down, although he did not particularly look like Paul anymore. The forehead was now low and beetling. Tufts of wiry hair poked from a nose as red as the nose of a long-time drunkard. His eyes were bloodshot, and one had a slight of cast to it. The axe was no longer on his shoulder. Paul was leaning on its haft, and the blunt end of its head had crushed a tent in the concretes of the sidewalk. He was still grinning, but there was nothing cheery about it now. From between gigantic yellow teeth, there drifted a small animals, rotten in a hot underbrush. "I'm going to eat you up," the giant had said in a low, rumbling voice. It was the sound of boulders rocking against each other during an earthquake. "Unless you give me back my hen and my heart and my bags of gold, I'm going to eat you right the fuck up." The breath of his words made Richie's shirt fluttered and flapped like a sail in a hurricane. He shrank back against the bench, eyes bugging, hair standing out to all his sides like quills wrapped in a pocket of Karen's stink. The giant begun to laugh. It settled its hands on the haft of its axe the way Ted Williams might have laid hold of his favorite baseball bat, or ash handle if you prefer. It pulled it out of the hole it had made in the sidewalk. The axe began to rise into the air. It made a low, level Russian sound. Richie suddenly understood that the giant meant to split him right down the middle, but he felt that he could not move. A logy sort of a paraffin had sortling over him. What did it matter? He was dozing, having a dream. Any moment now, some driver would blow his horn at a kid running across the street, and he would wake up. "That's right," the giant had rumbled. "You'll wake up in hell." And at the last instant, as the axe slowed to an epilogue and balanced there, Richie understood that this wasn't a dream at all, and if it was a dream that could kill, trying to scream but making no sound at all. He rolled off the bench and onto the rake-gravelled plot, which surrounded what had been a statue and was now only a base with two huge steel bolts sticking out of it where the feet had been. The sound of the descending axe filled the world with its prison incidents whisper. The giant's grin had begun a murderous grimace. Its lips had pulled back so far from its teeth that its plastic red gums hideous red glims. The blade of the axe struck the bench where Richie had been only an instant before. The edge was so sharp that there was almost no sound at all, but the bench was sheared instantly in two. The halves sagged away from each other, the wood inside the green-painted skin, a bright and somehow sickening white. Richie was on his back, still trying to scream. He pushed himself with his heels. Gravel went down the collar of his shirt, down the back of his pants, and there was Paul, towering above him, looking down at him with eyes the size of manhole covers. There was Paul, looking down at one small boy covering on the gravel. The giant took a step toward him. Richie felt the ground stuttered. When the black boot came down, gravel spun up in a cloud. Richie rolled over onto his stomach and staggered to his feet. His legs were already trying to run before he was balanced, and as a result, he fell flat on his belly again. He heard the wind woof out of his lungs. His hair fell in his eyes. He could see the traffic going back and forth on Canal and Main Streets, as it did every day, as if nothing was happening, as if no one in any of those cars could see or care that Paul Bunyan had come to life and stepped down from its pedestal in order to commit murder with an axe roughly the size of a deluxe motor. The sunshine was blotted out. Richie lay in a patch of shade that looked like a man. He scrambled to his knees, almost fell over sideways, managed to get his feet, and ran as fast as he could. He ran with his knees popping almost all the way up to his chest, and his elbows pistoling. Behind him, he could hear that awful president's whisper building again, a sound that seemed to be not really sound at all, but pressure on his skin and eardrums. Swip! The earth shook. Richie's upper and lower teeth rattled against each other like china plates in the earthquake. He did not have to look to know that Paul's axe had buried itself half deep in the sidewalk, inches behind his feet. Madly in his mind, he heard the Dovilles. Oh, the kids in Bristol are sharp as a pistol. When they do, the Bristol stomp. He passed out of the giant shadow into the sunlight again, and as he did, he began to laugh, the same exhausted laughter that had come from him when he bolted downstairs in freezies, panting that hot snitch in his side. Again, he had at last risked a glance back over his shoulder. There was the statue of Paul Bunyan standing on the pedestal where it always stood, axe on its shoulder, head cocked toward the sky, lips parted in the eternal optimistic grin of the myth hero. The bench, which had been sheared in two, was whole and intact. Thank you very much. The gravel where tall Paul, he's a my all-ended fellowship, sang manically in Richie's head, had planted his huge foot, was raked, and immense except for the scuff spot where Richie had fallen off while he was getting away from the giant, dreaming. There was no footprints, no axe slash in the concern. There was nothing here but a boy who had been chased by other boys, bigger boys, and so had himself a very small but very potent dream about a homicidal colossus. The giant caught him in size. Henry Bowers, if you please. Shit, Richie said in a tiny wavery voice, and then uttered an uncertain laugh. He stood there a while longer, waiting to see if the statue would move again, perhaps wink, perhaps shift its axe from one shoulder to another, perhaps come down and have him again. But of course, none of those things happened. Of course. What, me worried? Hardy, har. A dream. No more than that. But as Abraham Lincoln or Scottrich or someone like that had once observed, enough was enough. It was time to go home and cool out, to make like Kooky on 77 Sunset Strip, and just lay chilly, and although it would have been quicker to cut through the city center grounds, he decided not to. He didn't want to get close to that statue again, so he had gone the long way around, and by that evening he had nearly forgotten the incident until now. Here sits a man, he thought. Here sits a man dressed in a mossy green sport coat, purchased at one of the best shops in Rodeo Drive. Here sits a man with bass weegens on his feet and Calvin Klein underwear to cover his ass. Here sits a man with soft contact lenses resting easily on his eyes. Here sits a man remembering the dream of a boy who fought on an Ivy League shirt with a Fruit Loop on the back and a pair of snapjack shoes was the height of fashion. Here sits a grown man looking at the same old statue. And hey, Paul, tall Paul, I'm here to say you're the same in every way. You ain't age a motherfucking day. The old exclamation still rang true in his mind. A dream, he supposed. He could believe in monsters if he had to. Monsters were no big deal. Hadn't he sat in radio studios at one time or another, reading news cops about such fellows as Indy Amendola and Jim Jones, and that guy who had blown away all those folks in McDonald's just down the road a piece? Shitfire and save matches. Monsters were cheap. Who needed a $5 movie ticket when you could read about them in the paper for 35 cents or hear about them on the radio for free? And he supposed if he could believe in Jim Jones' variety, he could believe in Mike Hanlon's version, at least for a while. It even had its own sorry charm because it came from outside, and no one had to claim responsibility for it. He could believe in a monster that had as many faces as there are rubber masks in novel in shops. If you're gonna have one, you might as well have a pack of them. He fought cheaper by the dozen. Right, gang? At least for the sake of argument, but a 30-foot high plastic statue that stepped off its presidential and then tried to carve you up with its plastic axe? That was just a little too ripe, as Abraham Lincoln or Scotch or someone had also said. I'll eat fish and I'll eat meat, but there is some shit I will not eat. It just wasn't. That sharp needle in pain struck his eyes again, without warning, jerking a dismayed cry from him. This was the worst yet, going deeper and lasting longer, scaring the beetroot out of him. He clapped his hands to his eyes and then groped inventionable for the bottom lids with his forefingers. meaning to pop his contacts out. It's maybe some kind of infection, he thought dimly, but Jesus, it hurts. He pulled the lids down and was ready to give the single, particular blink that would send them trembling out, and he would spend the next 15 minutes groveling martyrical for them in the gravel surrounding the bench. But Jesus God, who gave a shit right now? It felt like there were nails in his eyes when the pain disappeared. It did not dwindle. It just went. One moment there. The next moment gone. His eyes teared briefly and then stopped. He lowered his hands slowly, his heart running fast in his chest, ready to blink them out. The instant the pain started again, it didn't, and suddenly he found himself thinking about the only horror movie that had ever really scared him as a kid. Possibility because he had taken so much shit about his glasses and had spent so much time thinking about his eyes. That movie had been The Crawling Eye with Forrest Tucker. Not very good. The other kids had laughed themselves into a hysterical kick over it, but Richie had not laughed. Richie had been redundant, cold and white and dumb, for once with not a single voice to command, as that gentlest tentacle eye came out of the manufacturing fog of some English movie set, waving its fibrous tentacles in front of it. The sight of that eye had been very bad, the embodiment of 100 not quite realized fears and disquiets. On some night, not long after he had dreamed of looking at himself in a mirror and bringing a large pin up and sticking it slowly into the black iris of his eye and feeling a nub watery springness as the bottom of his eyes filled up with blood. He remembered now. He remembered waking up and discovering that he had wet the bed. The best introduction of how gruesome that dream had been was that his primary feeling had, and not shame at his non-doctoral instruction, but relief. He had embraced the warm, wet patch with his body and blessed the reality of his sight. "Fuck this," Richie Tozier said in a low voice that was not quite steady, and started to get up. He would go back to the Derry townhouse and take a nap. If this was Memory Lane, he preferred the LA freeway at rush hour. The pain in his eyes was probably no more than a single of exhaustion and jet lag, plus the stress of meaning the past all at once. In one afternoon, enough shocks, enough exploring. He didn't like the way his mind was skittering from one subject to the next. What was that Peter Gabriel tune? Shock the Monkey? Well, this monkey had been shocked enough. It was time to catch some Z's and maybe gain a little perspective. As he rose his eyes, went to the banquet in front of city center again. All at once the strength ran out of his legs and sat down again, hard. Richie Tozier, man of 1,000 voices, returns to Derry Lane of 1,000 dances. In honor of Trash Mouse's return, City Center proudly presents the Richie Tozier All Dead Rock Show. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, The Big Bopper, Frankie Lemonin, Gene Vincent, Marvin Gaye, House Band, Jim Hendrix, lead guitar, John Lennon, rhythm guitar, Phil Lynott, bass guitar, Kenneth Moon, drums, special guest vocalist Jim Morrison. Welcome home, Richie. You're dead too. He felt as if someone had whomped all the breath out of him, and then he heard that sound again, that sound that was half pressure on the skin and eardrums, that keen homicide whispering rush. Swip! He rolled off the bench onto the gravel, thinking so. This is what they mean by deja vu. Now you know. You'll never have to ask anybody again. He hit on his floor and rolled, looking up at the Paul Bunyan statue. Only it was no longer Paul Bunyan. The clown stood there. Instead, residential in evidence, fantastic in plastic, 20 feet of day glow, colors. Its painted face, summered in a cosmic comic, rough orange pom-pom buttons, cast in plastic, each as big as a volleyball, ran down the front of the silver and suit. Instead of an axe in it, held a huge bunch of plastic balloons. Engraved on each were two legends. It's still rock and roll to me and Richie Tozier's All Dead Rock Show. He scrambled backward, using his heel in his palms. Gravel went down the back of his pants. He heard a seam tear loose in the underream of the Rhodian Drive sport coat. He rolled over, gained his feet, staggered, looked down. The clown looked down at him. Its eyes rolled wetly in their sockets. Did I give you a scare, madam? It rumbled, and Richie heard his mouth say quite independently of his frozen brain, cheap frills in the back of the car, bozo. That's all. The clown grinned and nodded, as if it had expected no more. Red paint bleeding lips parted to show teeth like fangs, each one coming to a razor point. I could have you now if I wanted you now, it said. But this is going to be fun, too much fun. Fun for me, too, Richie heard his mouth say. And the most fun of all, when we come to take your fucking head off, baby. The clown's grin spread wider and wider. It raised one hand, cloud, in a white glove, and Richie felt the wind of the movement blow the hair off his forehead, as if it had on that 27 years ago. The clown index finger popped out at him. It was big as a beam, Richie thought, and then the pain struck again. It drove rusty spikes into the soft jelly of his eyes. He screamed and clutched at his face before removing it, the mote from the neighbor's eyes. Attend the beam and fin, the clown noted. Its words rumbling and vibrating, and Richie was again enveloped in the sweet stink of its carrion breath. He looked up and took half a dozen hurried steps backwards. The clown was bending down, its gloves hands on its galley pantalooned knees. Want to play some more, Richie? How about if I point at your pecker and it give you a post-strain cancer? Or I could point at your head and give you a good old brain tumor. Although I'm sure people would say that would only be adding to what was already there. I could point at your mouth, and your stupid flapping tongue will turn you into some running pus. I could do it, Richie. Want to see? Its eyes were widening in those black pupils, each as big as a soft ball. Richie saw the mad darkness that must exist over the rim of the university. He saw a shitty happiness that he felt would drive him insane. And at that moment, he understood could do any of these things and more. And yet again, he heard his mouth. But this time, it was not his voice or any of his creatures' voice. Past or present, it was a voice he had never heard before. Later, he would tell the others hesitantly that it was kind of Mr. Jive-ass nigger voice, loud and proud, self-prone and dying and screeching. Get me off, Ma Case, you big old honky clown, he shouted, and suddenly he was laughing again. No shit and no shine, Muffet. I got the walk, I got the talk. I got the big popping cock. I got the time, I got the mind, I got a man with a plan, and if you don't shit, you gon' get. You hear me, you white-faced bunghole? Richie thought the clown recoiled, but he did not stick around to find out for sure. He ran elbows pumping sport coat, flying out in wings behind him, not carrying that a father who had stopped so his toddler could admire Paul was now staring warmly at him as if he had gone crazy. As a matter of fact, folks, Richie thought, I feel like I've gone crazy. Oh God, do I ever? And that had been the shittiest Grandmaster Flash emanation in history, but somehow it did the trick. Somehow, and the clown's voice thundered after him. The father of the little boy did not hear it, but the toddler's face suddenly pinched upon itself, and he began to wail. The dad picked his son up and hugged him, bewildered, even though his own terror. Richie observed this little sideshow closely. The voice of the clown was perhaps angrily gleeful, perhaps just angry. We got the eye down here, Richie. You hear me? The one that crawls. If you don't want to fly, don't want to say goodbye, you come on down under this here town and give a great big hi to one great big eye. You come down and see any time, just any old time you like. You hear me, Richie? Bring your yo-yo. Have Beverly wear a big full skirt with 4 or 5 petticoats underneath. Have her wear her husband's ring around her neck. Get Eddie to wear his saddle shoes. We'll play some bop, Richie. We'll play all the hits. Reaching the sidewalk, Richie dared to look back over his shoulder. And what he saw was in no way comforting. Paul Bunyan was still gone, and now the clown was gone too. Where they had stood, there was a 20-foot high plastic statue of Buddy Holly. He was wearing a button on one of the narrow lapels of his plaid sport coats. Richie Tozer's All Dead Rock Show, the button read. One bow of Buddy's glasses had been mended with azabeth tape. The little boy was still carrying hyperfonically. His father was walking rapidly back toward downtown with the weeping child in his arm. He gave Richie a wide breath. Richie got walking. Feet don't fail me now, trying to not think it about. Well, play all the hits. What had just happened? All he wanted to think about was the monster jolt of Scrotch. He was going to have in the dairy townhouse, but before he went up to take that nap, the thought of a drink, just your ordinary garden variety drink, made him feel little better. He looked over his shoulder one more time, and the fact that Paul Bunyan was back, grinning at the sky, plastic eyes over his shoulder, made him feel better. Still, Richie began to walk faster, making tracks, putting distance between himself and that statue. He had even begun to think about the positions brilliantly of hallucinations when the pain struck his eyes again, deep in agonously, causing him to cry out hoarsely. And pretty young girl who had been walking ahead of him, looking dreamily up at the breaking clouds, looked back at him, hesitated, then hurried over. Mister, are you all right? It's my contacts, he said in a strained voice. My damned contacts. Lee, oh my God, that hurts. This time he got his 4 fingers up so quickly he almost jabbed them into his eyes. He pulled down the lower kids and thought, I won't be able to blink them out. That's what's going to happen. I won't be able to blink them out, and it's just going to go on and hurting until I go blind. But one blink didn't, as one blink always had, the sharp and defined word where color stayed inside the lines and where faces that you saw clear and obvious simply fell away. Wide bands of pastel fuzz took their place. And although he had in the high school girls who was both helpful and concerned, searched the pavement of the sidewalk for the almost 15 minutes, neither could find even a single lens in the back of his head. Richie seemed to hear the clown laughing. 5. Bill Deprogue sees a ghost. Bill did not see Pennywise that afternoon, but he did see a ghost, a real ghost, so Bill believed then. And no subsequent events caused him to change his mind. He had walked up Witcham Street and paused it for some time by the drain, where George met his end on that rainy October day in 1957. He squatted down and peered into the drain, which was cut into the stonework of the curbing. His heart was beating hard, but he looked away. Come out, why don't you, he said in a low voice, and he had the not quite mad idea that his voice was floating along, dark and dripping passageways, not dying, but continuing onward and onward, feeding on its own echoes, bouncing off moss-covered stone walls and long-dead machinery. He felt and float over still and sullen waters, and perhaps issue softly from 100 different drains in other parts of the city at the same time. Come out of there, or we'll come in and get you. Get you. He waited nervously for a response, crouched down with his hand between his thighs, like a catcher between pitches. There was no response. He was about to stand up when a shadow fell over him. Bill looked up sharply, eagerly, ready for anything. But it was only a little kid, maybe 10, maybe 11. He was wearing faded Boy Scout shorts, which displayed his scabby knees to the good advantage. He had a freeze pop in one hand with a fiberglass skateboard, which looked almost as banter as his knees in the others. The freeze pop was a fluorescent orange. The skateboard was a fluorescent green. You always talk into the sewers, mister, the boy asked. Only in Derry, Bill said. They looked at each other, another solemnly for a moment, and then burst into laughter at the same time. I want to ask you a stupid question, Bill said. Okay, the kid said. You ever hear anything down in one of these? The kid looked at Bill, as though he had flipped out. Okay, Bill said. Forget I asked. Bill started to walk away and had gotten maybe 12 steps. He was heading up the hill, vaguely thinking he would take a look at the home place when the kid called Mister. Bill turned back. He had his sport coat hooked on his finger and slung over his shoulder. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie loosened. The boy was watching him carefully, as if already regretting his decision to speak further. Then he shrugged, as if he's saying, "Oh, what the hell?" Yeah? 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 What did it say? "I don't know. It talks some forging language. I heard it coming out of one of those piping stations down in the Barrens. One of those pumping stations. They look like pipes coming out of the ground." "I know what you mean. Was it a kid you heard?" "At first it was a kid. That it sounded like a man." The boy paused. "It was some scary. I ran home and told my father. He said maybe it was an echo or something, coming all the way down the pipes from someone's house." "Did you believe that?" The boy smiled charmingly. "I read in my Ripley's Believe It or Not book that there was this guy. He got music from his teeth. Radio music. His villains were like little radios. I guess if I believed that, I could believe anything." "Uh-huh," Bill said. "But did you believe it?" The boy regular shook his head. "Did you ever hear those voices again?" "Once, when I was taking a bath," the boy said. "It was a girl's voice, just crying, no words. I was assured to pull the plug when I was done, because I thought I might, drown her." Bill nodded again. The kid was looking at Bill, openly now, his eyes shining and fascinated. "You know about those voices, mister?" "I heard them," Bill said, "a long, long time ago." "Did you know any of those kids that may have been murdered here, son?" The shine went out of the kid's eyes. It was replaced by caution and disquiet. "My dad says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers. He says anybody that could be that killer." He took an adaptional step away from Bill, moving into the dapple shade of an Elm Street that Bill had once driven his bike to 27 years ago. He had taken a spill and bent his handlebars. "Not me, kid," he said. "I've been in England for the last 4 months. I just got into Derry yesterday." "I still don't have to talk to you," the kid replied. "That's right," Bill agreed. "It's a free country." He paused and then said, "I used to pal around with Johnny Furrin some of the time. He was a good kid," I cried. The boy finished matter-of-factly and slurped down the rest of his freeze pop as an afterthought. He ran out his tongue, which was temporarily brought orange, and lapped off his arm. "Keep away from the sewers and drains," Bill said quietly. "Keep away from empty places and deserted places. Stay out of train yards. But most of all, stay away from the sewers and the drains." The shine was back in the kid's eyes, and he said nothing for a very long time. Then, "Mister, you want to hear something funny?" "Sure. You know that movie where the shark ate all the people? Everyone does. Jaws. Well, I got this from my friend, His name was Tony Vegetance, and he's not bright. Toys in the attic. You know what I mean?" "Yeah, he thinks he saw that shark in the canal. He was up there by himself in a Bassy Park a couple of weeks ago, and he said he's seen this fin. He says it was 8 or 9 feet tall. Just the fin was that tall. You got me?" He goes, "That's what killed Johnny and the others kids. It was Jaws. I know because I saw it, so I go. That canal's so polite and nothing would live it in. Not even in a minnow. And you think you saw Jaws in there?" "You got toys in the attic, Tommy." Tommy says it, reared right out of the water, like it did at the end of the movie, and tried to bite him. And he just got back in time. "Pretty funny, huh, mister?" "Pretty funny," Bill agreed. "Toys in the attic, right?" Bill hesitated. "Look, stay away from the canal too, son. You follow? You mean you believe it?" Bill hesitated. Meant to shrug. Instead, he nodded. The kid let out his breath in a low hiss and rush. He hung his head as if ashamed. "Yeah, sometimes I think I must have toys in the attic." "I know what you mean." Bill walked over to the kid, who glanced up at him solemnly, but didn't shy away this time. "You're killing your knees on that board, son." The kid glanced down at his scabby knees and grinned. "Yeah, I guess so. I bail out sometimes." "Can I try it?" Bill asked suddenly. The kid looked at him, gape-mouthed at first, then laughing. "That'd be funny," he said. "I never saw a grown man up on a skateboard." "I'll give you a quarter," Bill said. "My dad said never take money or candy from strangers. Good advice. I'll still give you a quarter." "What do you say?" "Just to the corner of Jackson Street." Never mind, the quarter, the kid said. He burst into laughter again, a gay and uncompliment sound, a fresh sound. I don't need your quarter. I got $2. I'm particularly rich. I got to see this, though. Just don't blame me if you break something. Don't worry, Bill said. I'm insured. He turned one of the skateboard's suffocal wheels with his fingers. Like in the Speedy East, which it turned, it sounded like there was a million ball bearings in there. It was a good sound. It called up something very old in Bill's chest. Some desire, as warm as want, as lovely as love. He smiled. What do you think? The kid asked. I think I'm gonna kill myself, Bill said, and the kid laughed. Bill put the skateboard on the sidewalk and put one foot on it. He rolled it back and forth experimentally. The kid watched in his mind. Bill saw himself rolling down Witcham Street toward Jackson on the kid's avocado green skateboard, the tails of his sport coat ballooning out behind him, his bald head gleaming in the sun, his knees bent in that fragile way snow bunnies bend their knees. Their first day on the slopes, it was a poster that told you that in their heads they were already falling down. He bet the kid didn't ride the board like that. He bet the kid rode to beat the devil like there was no tomorrow. That good feeling died out of his chest. He saw all too clearly the board going out from under his feet, shooting in a Mercedes down the street in a mortal flustering green, a color that only a child could love. He saw himself coming down on his ass, maybe on his back, slow, devolved to a private room at the Dairy Home Hospital, like the one they had visit Eddie in after his arm had been broken. Bill Debrogue in a full body cast, one leg held up by pull-ins, and writes. A doctor comes in, looks at his chart, looks at him, and then says, you were guilty of 2 major lapses, Mr. Debrogue. The first one was mismanagement of a skateboard. The second was forgetting that you are now approaching 40 years of age. He picked the skateboard back up, and handed it back to the kid. I guess not, he said. Chicken, the kid said. Not unlikely. Bill looked his thumb into his armpit and flapped his elbow. Buck, 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 he said. The kid laughed. Listen, I got to get home. Be careful on that, Bill said. You can't be careful on a skateboard, the kid replied, looking at Bill as if he might be the one with toys in the attic. Right, Bill said. Okay, as we say in the movie, Biz, I hear you, but stay away from the drains and sewers, and stay with your friends. The kid nodded. I'm right near home. So was my brother, Bill thought. It'll be over soon anyway, Bill told the kid. Will it? The kid asked. I think so, Bill said. Okay, see you later, chicken. The kid put one foot on the board and pushed off with the other. Once he was rolling, he put the other foot on the board as well, and went thundering down the street at what seemed to Bill suicidal pace. But he rode as Bill had suspected he would, with lazy hip-shot grace. Bill felt loved for the boy, an exhilaration and a desire to be the boy, along with an almost suffocating fear. The boy rode as if there was no such thing as death or getting older. The boy seemed somehow internal and egleptical in his khaki Boy Scout shorts and scuffed sneakers, and his ankles sockless and quite dirty, his hair flying back behind him. Watch out, kid. You're not going to make the corner, Bill thought, alarmed, but the kid shot his hips to the left like a breakdancer. His toes revolved on the green Fablitude's board, and he zoomed effortless around the corner and onto Jackson Street, simply assuming no one would be there to get in his way. Kid, Bill thought, it won't always be that way. He walked up to his old house, but did not stop. He only slowed his walk down to an elder's place. There were people on the lawn, a mother in a lawn chair, a sleeping baby in his arm, watching 2 kids, maybe 10 and 8, play badminton in grass that was still wet from the rain. Earlier, the younger of the 2 boy managed to hit the bird back over the net, and the woman called, "Good one, Sean." The house was the same dark green color, and fanlight was still over the door, but his mother's flower beds were gone. So, from what he could see, was the jungle gym his father had built from scavengers, pipes in the backyard. He remembered the day Georgie had fallen off the top and chipped a tooth. How he had screamed. He saw these things, the one there and the one's gone, and thought of walking over to the woman with the sleeping baby in her arms. He thought of saying, "Hello, my name is Bill Diprog. I used to live here." And the woman saying, "That's nice." What else could there be? Could he ask her if the face he had carved carefully in one of the attic beams, the face he and Georgie sometimes used to throw darts at, was still there? Could he ask her if her kids sometimes slept on the screens and back porch when the summer nights were especially hot, talking together in low tones as they watched? Heat lightened, danced on the horizon. He supposed he might be able to ask of those things, but he felt he would stutter quite badly if he tried to be charming. And did he really want to know the answers to any of those questions? After Georgie died, it had become a cold house, and whenever he had come back to Derry for was not here. So he went on the corner and turned right, not looking back. Soon he was on Kensington Street, heading back downtown. He paused for a while at the fence which bordered the sidewalk, looking down into the barrens. The fence was the same, ricketed wood, covered with fading whitewash, and the barrens looked the same, wooden, if anything. The only differences he could see were that the dirty smudge of smoke, which had always marked the town dump, was gone. The dump had been replaced with a modern waste treatment plant, and a long overpass marched across the tangled greenery. Now the turnback extension. Everything else was so similar that he might last have seen it the previous summer. Weeds and bushes slopping down to the flat Martian area on the left, and two dense corpses of junky scrubbing trees on the right. He could see the stands of what they had called bamboo, the silver-white stalks, 12 and 14 feet high. He remembered that Richie had once tried to smoke some of it, claiming it was like the stuff jazz musicians smoke and could get you high. All Richie had gotten was sick. Bill could hear the trickle of water running in many small streams, could see the sun holographing off the border expanse of the Kensington, and the smell was the same, even the dump gone. The heavy perfume of growing things at the height of their spring sprout did not quite mask the smell of waste, of human and oval. It was faint but unmistakable, a smell of corruption, of whiff of the underside. That's where it ended before it, and that's where it was going to end this time. Bill thought with a shiver. In there, under the city, he stood a while longer, convinced that he must seen something, some malefaction on the evil he had come back to Derry to fight. There was nothing. He heard water run in a spring-like and vintal sound that reminded him of the dam they had built down there. He could see trees and bushes ruffling in the faint breeze. There was nothing else. No sign. He walked on, dusting a faint whitewash stain from his hands as he went. He kept heading downtown, half remembering, half dreaming, and here came another kid, this one a little girl of about 10 and high-waisted corduroy pants and a faded red blouse. She was bouncing a ball with one hand and holding a baby doll by its blonde Ariel hair in the udder. "Hey," Bill said. She looked up. "What?" "What's the best store in Derry?" She thought about it. "For me or for anyone?" "For you," Bill said. "Second-hand rose, second-hand clothes," she said with no hesitation whatever. "I beg your pardon," Bill said. "I beg what?" "I mean, is that a store name?" "Sure," she said, looking at Bill as though he might well be infeasible. "Second-hand rose, second-hand clothes. My mom says it's a junk shop, but I like it. They have old things, like records you never heard of. Also postcards. It smells like an attic. I have to go home now. Bye." She walked on, not looking back, bouncing her ball and holding her doll by the hair. "Hey!" he shouted after her. She looked back whimsically. "I beg your watch and mallet. The store. Where is it?" She looked back over her shoulder and said, just the way you're going. It's up the bottom of Up Mile Hill." Bill felt that sense of the past folding in on itself, folding in on him. He hadn't meant to ask that little girl anything. The question had popped out of his mind, like a cork flying from the neck of a champagne bottle. He descended it, up Mile Hill, toward downtown, the warehouses and packing plants. He remembered from childhood gloomy brick buildings with dirty window from which Titanic meaty smells issued were almost gone, although the armor and the star beef meat packing plants were still there. But Hemp Hill was gone, and there was a drive-in bank and a bakery where Eagle beef and kosher meats had been. And there, where the Tracker brothers' Aitniks had stood, was a sign painted in old-fashioned letters, which read just as the girl with the doll had said, "Second-hand rose, second-hand clothes." The red brick had been painted a yellow, which had perhaps been jammed 10 or 12 years ago, but was now dignity a color. Audrey called, "You're in yellow." Bill walked slowly toward it, feeling that sense of deja vu settle over him again. Later, he told the others he knew what ghost he was going to see before he actually saw it. This show window of second-hand rose, second-hand clothes was more dignity. It was filthy. No down east Anquet shop this, with nifty little spool beds and hostelry cabinets and sets of depression glassware highlighted by hidden spotlights. This was that his mother called, with utter disdain, a Yankee pawn shop. The items were stewed in writ-rack profusion, help aimlessly, here, there, and everywhere dressed slumped off, coat hangers, guitars hung from their neck like executed criminals. There was a box of 45 RPM records, 10C, appreciate, the sign read, 12 for a buck, Andrew's Sisters, Perry Como, Jimmy Rogers, others. There were kids' outfits and dreadful-looking shoes with a card in front of them which read seconds, but not bad, $1 a pair. There were 2 TVs that looked fine. A third was casting bleared images of the Brady Bunch out toward the street. A box of old paperbacks, most with stripped covers, 2 for a quarter, 10 for $1. More inside, some hot, sat a stop, large radio with a filthy white plastic case and a tunning dial as big as an alarm clock. Bunches of plastic flowers sat in dirty vases on a chip dusty dining room table. All of these Bill saw as a chaotic background to the things his eyes had fixed upon. Immediately, he stood staring at it with wide, unbelieving eyes. Goose flesh ran madly and down his body. His forehead was hot, his hands cold, and for a moment it seemed that all the doors inside would swing wide and he would remember everything. Silver was in the right-hand window. His kickstand was still gone, and rust and followed on the front and back fenders, but the Uga horn was still there on the handlebars. Its rubber bulb now glazed with cracks and ages. The horn itself, which Bill had always kept neatly polished, was still dull and pitted. The flat package carrier where Richie had often ridden double was still on the back fender, but it was bent now, hanging by a single book. At some point, someone had covered the seat with a imitation tiger skin, which was now rubbed and frayed to a point where the stripes were almost indistinguishable. Silver Bill raised an absent hand to wipe away the tears that were running slowly down his cheeks after he had done a better job with his handkerchief. He went inside. The astronomer of second rows and second-hand clothes was musty with age. It was, as the girl had said, an attic smell, but not a good smell, as some attic smells are. This was not the smell of a linseed oil rub loving into the surface of old tables or of an ancient plush and velvet. And where was a smell of rotten book bindings, dirty vinyl cushions that had been half cooked in the hot suns of summer past, dust, mouse turds. From the TV in the window, the Brady Bunch cackled and whooped completely with them. From somewhere in the back was the radio voice of a disc. jockey identified himself as your pal Bobby Russell promises the new album by Prince the Seller, who could give the name of the actor who had all played Wally on Leave It on to Beaver. Bill knew it had been a kid named Tony Doan, but he didn't want the new Prince album. The radio was sitting on a high shelf amid a number of 19th century portraits. Below it, and then sat the portrait in a man of perhaps 40 who was wearing a designer jeans and a fishnet t-shirt. His hair was slick back, and he was thin to point of an explanation. His feet were cocked up on his desk, which was piled high with ledgers and documented by an old scroll cash register. He was reading a paperback novel, which Bill thought had never been nominated for the Puzzle and prizes. It was called Construction Site Struts. On the floor in front of the desk was a barber pole, its stripe revolving up and up into infinity, its frayed cord wound across the floor to a base board plugged like a tired snake. The sign in front of it read, a divine breed, $250. When the bell over the door jingled, the man behind the desk marked his place with a matchbook cover and looked up. Help you? Yes, Bill said, and opened his mouth to ask about the bike and the window. But before he could speak, his mind was suddenly filled with a single-handed set words that drove away all other thoughts. He thrust his fist against the post, and still, instead, he seems to go. What in the name of God? Frusses. Looking for anything in particular? The property asked. His voice was polite enough, but he was looking at Bill closely. He's looking at me, Bill thought, admiring spite of his disgrace. As if he's got an idea. I've been smoking some of that stuff that gets the jazz musicians. Yes, I was interested in the... His fist against the post. In the barber pole, you mean? The proprietor's eyes now showed Bill something which, even in his presence confused state, he remembered and hated from his childhood. The anxiety of a man or woman who most listened to a stutter and to the urge to jump and quickly and finish the thought that this fuss stutter the poor bastard up, but I don't stutter. I don't beat it. I don't fucking stutter. And still insisted. The words were so clear in his mind that it seemed someone else must be speaking there, that he must be like a man possessed by demons in biblical times, a man invaded by some presidents from outside, and yet he recognized the voice and he knew it was his own. He felt sweat pop out warmly on his face. I could give you, he see ghosts, a deal on that post, the portrait was saying. Tell you the truth, I can't move it at $250. I'd give it to you for $175. How's that? It's the only real anquick in the place. Post. Pole! Bill almost screamed in the particular recall. A little, not the pole I'm interested in. Are you okay, mister? The appropriate asked his socialite tone. Bewailed the expression of hard-wornness in his eyes, and Bill saw his left hand leave the desk. He knew with the flash of something that was really more inductive reasoning in intention, that there was an open drawer below Bill's own sight light, and that the proprietor had almost surely put his hand on a pistol of some type. He was maybe worried about robbery. More likely, he was just worried he was after all clearly gay, and this was the town where the local Jovelins had give Adrian Mellon a temporal bath. He thrust his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. I drove out, although he was like being insane. Where had it come from? He thrust, repeating and repeating. With a sudden titanic effort, Bill attacked it. He did this by forcing his mind to translate the alien senses into French. It was the same way he had beaten the stutter as a teenager. As the words marched across his field of thought, he changed. Then, and suddenly, he felt the grip of the stutter loosen. He realized that the propender had been saying something. Pardon me? I said, if you're going to have to fit, take it out on the street. I don't need shit like that in here. Here, Bill drew in a deep breath. Let's just start over, okay? I pretend I just came in there. Okay, the porter said agreeably enough. You just came in, now what? The bike in the window, Bill said. How much do you want for the bike? Take $20. He sounded easier now, but his left hand still hadn't come back into the view. I think it was Shintwin at one time, but it's a girl. His eyes measured. Bill, big bike. You could ride it yourself. Thinking of its kids' green skateboards. Bill said, I think my bike riding days are over. The proprietor shrugged. His left hand finally came up again. Got it, boy? Yes. How old is he? 11. Big bike for an 11-year-old. Will you take a traveler's check? Long as it's no more than $10 over the amount of the purchase. I can give you 20, Bill said. Mind if I make a phone call? Not if it's for the locals. It is. Be my guest. Bill called the Derry Public Library. Mike was there. Where are you, Bill? He asked, and then immediately. Are you all right? I'm fine. Have you seen any of the others? No, we'll see them tonight. There was a brief pause. That is, I presume. What can I do you for, Big Bill? I'm buying a bike, Bill said calmly. I wondered if I could wheel it up to your house. Do you have a garage or something? I could store it in. There was silence. Mike, are you? I'm here, Mike said. Is it silver? Bill looked at the proprietor. He was reading his book again, or maybe just looking at it and listening carefully. Yes, it said. Where are you? It's called Secondhand Rose, Secondhand Clothes. All right, Mike said. My place is 61 Parlon Lane. You want to go up Main Street? I can find it. All right, I'll meet you there. Want some supper? That would be nice. Can you get off work? No problem, Carol will cover for me. Mike hesitated again. She said that a fellow was in about an hour before I got back here. She said he left looking like a ghost. I got her to describe him. It was Ben. You sure? Yeah, and the bike, that's a part of it, too. Isn't it? Shouldn't wonder, Bill said, keeping an eye on the proprietor, who still appeared to be astorbated in his book. I'll see you at my place, Mike said. Number 61, don't forget. I won't. Thank you, Mike. God bless, Bill. Big Bill. Bill hung up. The proprietor properly closed his book again. Got you some storage space, my friend. Yeah, Bill took out his traveler checks and signed his name to a 20. The proprietor examined 2 signatures. Would it care that in the district mental circumstances, Bill would have found rather insulting. At last, the proprietor scribbled a bill of sale and popped the traveler's check into his old cash register. He got up, put his hands on the small of his back and stretched, then walked to the front of the store. He picked up his way around the heaps of junk and almost junk merchandise with an absent deliverance Bill found fascinating. He lifted the bike, swung it around, and rolled it to the edge of display space. Bill laid hold on the handlebars to help him, and as he did, another stutter went through him. Silver again. It was silver in his hands, and thrust his fist against the post, and still insists he sees the ghost. He had to force the thought away because it made him feel faint and strange. That back tire's a little soft, the proprietor said. It was, in fact, as flat as a pancake. The front tire was up, was so bald the cord was showing through in places. No problem, Bill said. You can handle it from here. I used to be able to handle it just fine now. I don't know. I guess so, Bill said. Thanks. Sure, and if you want to talk about the barber pole, come back. The proprietor held the door for him. Bill walked the bike out, turned left, and stared toward Main Street. People glanced with amusement and curiosity at the man with the bald head pushing the huge bike with a flat rear tire and the ooge horn proprietor over the rusty bike basket. But Bill hardly noticed them. He was marveling at now his grown-up hands still fitted. The rubber hand grips was remembering now. He had always meant to knot some thin strips of plastic, different colors, into the holes in each grip so they would flutter in the wind. He had never gotten around to that. He stopped at the corner of Center of Main, outside of Mr. Piperback. He leaned the bike against the building long enough to strip off his sports coat. Pushing a bike with a flat tire was hard work, and the afternoon had come off hot. He tossed the coat into the basket. It went off. Chains rusty, he thought. Whenever had it didn't take very good of him. He stopped for a moment, frowning, trying to remember just what had happened to Silver. Had he sold it, given it away, lost perhaps? He couldn't remember. Instead, that idiotic sentence, his fit against the posts, and still insists, resuffered, as strange and out of place as an easy chair of a battlefield, a record player in a fireplace, a row of pencils protruding from a cement sidewalk. Bill shook his head. The senses broke up and disappear like smoke. He pushed Silver onto Mike's place. 6. Mike Hanlon makes a connection. But first he made supper, hamburgers with softened mushrooms and onions and a spinach salad. They had finished working on Silver by then and were more than ready to eat. The house was a neat little Cape Cod, white with green trim. Mike had just been arriving when Bill pushed Silver up Palmer Lane. He was behind the wheel of an old Ford with rusty rocker panels and a cracked rear window, and Bill remembered the fact that Mike had so quietly pointed out the 6 members of the Losers Club who left Derry, had quit being losers. Mike had stayed behind and was still behind. Bill rolled Silver into Mike's garage, which was floored with oiled dirt and was every bit as neat as the house proved to be. Tools hung from pegs and the lights shielded with tin cones. Looked like the lights with hangover tables. Bill leaned the bike against the wall. The two of them looked at it without speaking for a bit. Hands in pockets. "It's Silver, all right," Mike said at last. "I thought you might have been wrong, but it's him. What are you going to do with him? Fucked if I know. Have you got a bicycle pump?" "Yeah, I think. I've got a tire patching kit, too. Are those tubeless tires?" "They always were." Bill bent down to look at the flat tire. "Yeah, tubeless. Getting ready to ride it again." "Of course," Bill said sharply. I don't like to see it hidden on there on a flat." "Whenever you say, Big Bill. You're the boss." Bill looked around sharply at that. But Mike had gone at the garage's back wall and was taking down a tire pump. He got a tin tire patching kit from one of the cabins and handed it to Bill, who looked at it curiously. It was as he remembered to such things from his childhood, a small tin box of about the same size and shape as though kept by men who rolled their own cigarettes, except the top was bright, and the pebble you used it for roughing the rubber around the hole before you put on the patch. The box looked brand new, and there was a Woolick price sticker on it that said $7.23. It seemed to him that when he was a kid, such a kit had gone for about $1.25. "You didn't just have his hanging around," Bill said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Mike agreed. "I brought it last week, all out at the mall, as a matter of fact." "You got a bike of your own?" "No," Mike said, meeting his eyes. "You just happened to buy this kit." "You got the urge," Mike agreed, his eyes still on Bill's. Woke up thinking it might come in handy. The thought kept coming back all day. "So I got the kit, and here you are to use it." "Here I am to use it," Bill agreed. "But like they said on the soaps, what does it all mean, dear?" "Ask the others," Mike said. "Tonight. Will they all be there, do you think?" "I don't know, Big Bill." He paused and added, "I think there's a chance that all of them won't be. One or two of them may decide to just creep out of town," or he shrugged. What do we do if that happens? I don't know, Mike pointed to the tire patching kit. I paid $7 for that thing. Are you going to do something with it or just look at it? Bill took his sport coat out of the basket and hung it carefully on an unoccupied well peg. Then he turned Silver upside down so that he rested on his seat and began to carefully rotate the rear tire. He didn't like the rusty way the axle squeaked and remembered the almost silent click of the ball bearings in the kid's skateboard. A little 3-in-1 oil would fix that right up, he thought. Wouldn't hurt to oil the chain either. It's rusty as hell. And playing cards. It needs playing cards on the spokes. Mike would have cards. I bet the good ones. Bikes with the coating that made them so stiff and so slippery that the first time you tried to shuffle them, they always sprayed all over the floor. Playing cards, sure, and clothespins to hold them. He stopped suddenly cold. What in the name of Jesus are you thinking of? Something wrong, Bill, Mike asked softly. Nothing, his fingers touched. Something small and round and hard. He got his nails under it and pulled. A small tack came out of the tire. Here's the culprit, he said. And it rose in his mind again, strange, unbidden, and powerful. He thrust his fist against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. But this time, his voice was followed by his mutter saying, try again, Bill. You almost had it that time. And Andy Devine as Guy Madison, sidekicks Jingles yelling, Hey, Wild Bill, wait for me. He shivered, the posters. He shook his head. I couldn't say that without stuttering even now. He fought for just a moment. He felt that he was on the edge of understanding it all. Then, it was gone. He opened the tire patching kit and went to work. It took a long time to get it just right. Mike leaned against the wall in the bar of late afternoon sun, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up and his tire yanked down, whistling a tune which Bill finally identified as She Blinded Me with Science. While he waited for the tire cement to set, Bill had just for something to do, he told himself. Oiled Silver's chain, sprocket, and ankles. It didn't make the bike look any better, but when he spun the tires, he found that the squeak was gone, and that was satisfying. Silver never would have won any beauty contest anyway. His one virtue was that he could go like a blue streak. By the time 5:30 the afternoon, he had nearly forgotten Mike was there. He had become completely absorbed in a small yet unnearthly satisfied axe, and Nancy screwed the nozzle of the pump onto the rear tires, valves, and watched the tire fatten, shooting for the right pressure by guess, and by gosh, he was pleased to see that the patch was holding nicely. When he thought he had him right, he unscrewed the pump nozzle and was about to turn Silver over when he heard the rapid snap flutter of playing cards behind him. He whirled, almost knocking Silver over. Mike was standing there with a deck of blue-backed bicycle playing cards in one hand. Want these? Bill let out a long, shaky sigh. You've got a clothespin, too, I suppose. Mike took 4 from the flat pocket of his shirt and held them out. Just happened to have them around, I suppose. Yeah, something like that, Mike said. Bill took the cards and tried to shuffle them. His hand shook and the cards sprayed out his hand. They went anywhere, but only 2 landed face up. Bill looked at them, then up at Mike. Mike's gaze was frozen on the litter playing cards. His lips had pulled back from his teeth. The 2 up cards were both the ace of spades. That's impossible, Mike said. I just opened that deck. Look, he pointed at the swim can just inside the garage door, and Bill saw the cellophane wrapper. How can one deck of cards have 2 ace of spades? Bill bent down and picked them up. How can you spray a deck of cards all over the floor and have only 2 of them land face up? He asked. That's an even better question. He turned the aces over, looked, and then showed them to Mike. One of them was a blue-black back, the other a red back. Holy Christ, Mikey, what have you got us into? What are you going to do with those? Mike asked in a nubbed voice. Why put them on, Bill said, and suddenly he began to laugh. That's what I'm supposed to do, isn't it? If there's are certain preconditions of the use of magic, those preconditions will eventually arrange themselves, right? Mike didn't reply. He watched as Bill went to Silver's rear wheel and attached the playing cards. His hands were still shaking, and it took a while, but he finally got it done. Drew in one tight breath, held it, and spun. The rear wheel, the playing card machine, gunned loudly against the spokes in the guard's silence. "Come on," Mike said softly. "Come on in, Big Bill. I'll make us some chow." They had scoffed the burgers and now sat smoking, watching dark begin to unfold from dusk in Mike's backyard. Bill took out his wallet, found someone's business card, and wrote upon it in the sentence that had plagued him ever since he had seen silver in the window of second-hand clothes. He'd show it to Mike. He read it carefully. Lips pursed. "Does it mean anything to you?" Bill asked. He thrust his fist against the post and still insisted he sees the ghost. He nodded. "Yes, I know what that is." "Well, then tell me. Or are you going to give me some more crap about figuring out for myself?" "No," Mike said. "In this case, I think it's to tell you. The phrase goes back to English times. It's a tongue twister that became a speech exercise for lippers and stutters. Your mother kept trying to get you to say it that summer. The summer of 1958, you used to go around mumbling it to yourself." "I did," Bill said, and then slowly answering his own question. "I did. You must have wanted to please her very much." Bill, who suddenly felt he might cry, only nodded if he didn't trust himself to speak. "You never made it," Mike told him. "I remember that. You tried like hell, but your tongue kept getting all tangled up. But I didn't say it," Bill replied, "at least once, when Bill brought his fist down on the picnic table hard enough to hurt. "I don't remember," he shouted, and then dully he said it again. "I just don't remember."